Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Nathaniel Whitmore stood in the grand atrium of the Belgrave Auction House, a place of polished marble floors and walls adorned with priceless art. He had attended many auctions in his life, but none quite like this. The air was thick with anticipation, the soft murmur of collectors and curators exchanging whispers blending with the clink of fine wine glasses. To Nathaniel, the buzz of excitement was intoxicating, a sound that heralded the potential for something rare, something exceptional. His sharp eyes scanned the room, lingering on a small group of wealthy buyers clustered near a set of wooden display tables. On one of those tables, under a velvet cloth, lay the object of his focus, an antique painting, its edges curled with age. The auctioneer, a well-groomed man in his late 50s, stood next to the canvas, speaking to the crowd with practiced flair. Ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate today to offer a truly unique piece. A painting with a rich and, some might say, unsettling history. It is a work that has not been seen in public for over 30 years, if not longer. A dark jewel in any collection. The auctioneer's voice was low, almost conspiratorial. But be warned, this painting has a reputation of its own, one that is not entirely of this world. Nathaniel's interest peaked. The auctioneer's words were calculated, laced with an unspoken warning that only added to the allure. Nathaniel had heard rumors about the painting, whispers of its cursed past, but such things never bothered him. Superstition was for the weak-minded. To him, it was nothing more than a compelling story to heighten its value. The velvet cloth was pulled away, and Nathaniel's gaze locked onto the painting. The woman in the painting stared back at him with hollow eyes. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, but something about her expression made Nathaniel's skin prickle. She stood in the center of a dark, twisted forest, the gnarled trees surrounding her like watching sentinels. Her lips were slightly parted, as though she were about to speak, but no sound emerged. The shadows around her seemed to writhe, forming shapes that Nathaniel couldn't quite identify. The brushwork was exquisite, capturing both the innocence and the terror in her gaze. There was a strange beauty to the painting, yes, but also a chilling sense of something wrong. The auctioneer continued, oblivious to Nathaniel's growing unease. This is the work of an unknown artist, commissioned by a notorious occultist, Elias Grayson, in the late 1800s. There are no records of who the woman in the painting is, but legend has it she was a lover of Grayson's, a muse for his darkest rituals. When she betrayed him, some say he locked her soul away in this very painting, and it's been cursed ever since. The crowd tittered nervously. Some turned away, clearly uncomfortable with the dark tale. But not Nathaniel. He was drawn to it, compelled by the aura of mystery that clung to the canvas. The allure of owning such a piece, something so rare, so dangerous, was too great for him to ignore. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in power, in art, and in wealth. He raised his hand slowly, then with deliberate confidence, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. 1 million, he said. A ripple of surprise went through the room. The auctioneer looked at him, impressed, but with a hint of caution in his eyes. Do I hear 1,050,000? The auctioneer asked, his tone almost daring someone else to bid. But no one did. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Nathaniel knew that the painting was his. Sold. To the gentleman in the front row, the auctioneer declared, his gavel striking the podium with finality. Nathaniel stood, a small smile curling at the corner of his lips. As the crowd began to disperse, he made his way to the front, eager to complete his purchase. He had always believed that the best investments were those that others feared to touch. The curator, A thin man with gray hair and dark circles under his eyes approached him with a nod. "Mr. Whitmore, I must congratulate you on your acquisition. It is quite a rare piece." Nathaniel grinned. "Thank you. It will fit perfectly in my collection." The curator hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he handed Nathaniel the painting certificate of authenticity. "I must warn you, sir," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "Many have come to regret owning it. There are rumors, you see. It's not just the story of Elias Grayson. There are whispers of a curse, something that follows the painting wherever it goes. Some of its previous owners have disappeared, without a trace." Nathaniel's amusement faded, replaced by a quiet annoyance. "I'm not interested in folklore, my good man. I collect art, not stories." He took the certificate and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, he glanced back at the painting, now wrapped in protective cloth and waiting for transport. For a brief moment, his eyes met the hollow gaze of the woman in the painting, and a chill crawled down his spine. He shook it off, dismissing the feeling as nothing more than the after effect of a long auction. Nathaniel would soon learn that some things, once obtained, could never be forgotten. Nathaniel's driver, a stoic man named Gregory, waited outside in a sleek black car. Nathaniel climbed in the back seat, his thoughts consumed with the painting and the peculiar chill that had briefly unsettled him. He brushed it aside. No sense in being superstitious. He had secured a true gem, and that was what mattered. The drive back to his mansion on the outskirts of the city was uneventful, though Nathaniel couldn't shake the strange feeling lingering at the back of his mind. The painting, wrapped in heavy protective cloth, sat in the trunk, safely secured but somehow present in his thoughts. As the car pulled up the long, winding driveway, Nathaniel was already imagining where to place the piece. The front hall would be ideal, just beyond the grand staircase, where guests could admire it the moment they entered. He wanted the painting to be both a conversation starter and a symbol of his refined tastes. Gregory opened the door for him, and Nathaniel stepped out, inhaling the cold night air. His mansion, a sprawling estate of marble and glass, gleamed under the moonlight, and for a moment, he almost felt as though he were standing at the edge of some great achievement. Inside, the house felt oddly still, as though the warmth of the evening had already slipped away. He walked through the entrance hall, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. The tall windows revealed the garden outside, where trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows stretching long across the perfectly manicured lawn. "Place it in the study," Nathaniel told Gregory, his voice flat as he tried to ignore the creeping unease that was gnawing at him. "I'll examine it there." "Yes, sir," Gregory replied, and a few moments later, Nathaniel heard the sound of the painting being carefully brought into the study. The room was a cozy but grand space, lined with bookshelves and warm leather furniture. It had been Nathaniel's sanctuary for years, where he kept his rarest acquisitions, his most valuable books, and his personal collection of art. He had always loved the tranquility here, the quiet comfort of being surrounded by things he treasured. Gregory placed the painting carefully against the wall, leaving it covered for now. Nathaniel stepped forward, his excitement rising again. "Unwrap it," he instructed. Gregory hesitated for a split second, but he did as told. The cloth fell away, revealing the woman in the painting once more. Nathaniel stepped closer, his eyes tracing the brushstrokes with appreciation. Her gaze seemed sharper in this light, and the shadows in the background seemed even darker, more foreboding. He tried to shake off the sensation that the air around him was growing colder. He turned to Gregory. "That'll be all for now. You can leave." Gregory nodded, but just as he was about to exit, he stopped. His hand lingered on the doorframe, his face pale. "Sir," Gregory's voice was low, almost a whisper. "If you ever feel that something strange is happening with the painting, you must get rid of it. Please, I've heard the stories. No one who owns it is ever the same after." Nathaniel's patience thinned. He wasn't a man who tolerated fear-mongering. "I've already told you, Gregory," he said, his tone firm. "It's just a painting. There's no curse. It's an investment. Nothing more." Gregory didn't argue. He simply nodded again and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Nathaniel stood alone in the study, his eyes fixed on the painting. The woman seemed even more striking up close, her eyes so dark, her expression so haunting. He wasn't one for superstition, but for a fleeting moment, it almost felt as though she were staring directly into his soul. But Nathaniel shook the feeling off. He was a man of reason. He would let the painting settle into his collection, where it would be admired and appreciated for what it was, a masterpiece. He turned toward his desk, pulling out a bottle of aged scotch and pouring himself a drink. The rich amber liquid swirled in the glass as he took a long sip, feeling the warmth spread through him. The painting could wait. It was time to unwind. As he sat back in his leather chair, his eyes flickered back to the painting once more. For a moment, just a moment, the shadows in the background seemed to shift. The woman's lips parted slightly, as though she were about to speak. Nathaniel blinked and rubbed his eyes. No, it was nothing. The shadows were simply playing tricks on him. But then, he could have sworn he heard a faint whisper, a soft voice that seemed to echo from the painting itself. "Help me." He froze. His grip tightened on the glass in his hand. The voice was so faint, so delicate, like a breath on the wind. He stared at the painting, his heart beating a little faster. "Help me." It came again, but this time there was a sense of urgency, a rising panic that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Nathaniel stood abruptly, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. He moved toward the painting, as though compelled by something he couldn't explain. His hand hovered above the frame, a strange sense of dread crawling up his spine. But then, as quickly as the sensation came, it was gone. The room was silent. The woman's gaze was fixed, serene. Her lips were closed once more. There was no sign of movement, no whisper, just the stillness of the painting. Nathaniel shook his head, muttering to himself. "I'm imagining things," he thought. "It's just a painting." But as he turned away, something caught his eye, a flicker of shadow, just at the edge of the canvas. A shadow that didn't belong. Nathaniel stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadow in the corner of the painting seemed to shift, just a subtle movement that made his pulse race. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but it remained. A dark, undefined shape in the farthest reaches of the canvas, creeping along the edges like something waiting to emerge. His fingers brushed the frame of the painting, and for a moment, he swore he felt a coldness seep through the wood, chilling him to the bone. He yanked his hand away, suddenly aware of how the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on him from all sides. "It's nothing," he told himself. "Just shadows, just an old painting." But even as he tried to reassure himself, something felt wrong, too wrong to ignore. The whispering voice. It had sounded so real. The panic in its tone had been unmistakable. And yet, no one had ever spoken about the painting in such a way. No one had ever mentioned voices. Nathaniel took a step back, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He could feel his own breath becoming shallow, as if the room itself was suffocating him. The study, which had always been a place of comfort and solitude, now felt like a prison. He glanced toward the door, half expecting to see Gregory standing there, eyes wide with fear, ready to warn him about the painting's curse. But the door remained closed, and the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Another glance at the painting. The shadow was still there, now more defined, stretching toward the woman's figure. It was like it was, alive. Without thinking, Nathaniel crossed the room in a few quick strides and ripped the painting from the wall. The canvas felt cold, unnaturally so, and for a moment, he was convinced it was heavier than it had been earlier. As he turned it around to inspect the back, his fingers brushed the fabric, and a faint scrawl of words, too faint to be seen clearly, caught his eye. He leaned closer, his breath coming faster now. The writing, small and almost indecipherable, looked like it had been scratched into the wood with sharp nails. "I did not die." The words, barely legible, sent a chill through Nathaniel's body. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, an inexplicable sense of dread washing over him. His eyes darted from the back of the painting to the woman's face again. Was she watching him? A sudden noise broke the stillness, a soft thud, as though something heavy had dropped in the other room. Nathaniel froze. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural scrape. He swallowed hard and walked quickly to the door, opening it just enough to peer into the hallway. His breath hitched. There was nothing, just the empty stretch of corridor that led to the staircase. The noise stopped. Nathaniel closed the door slowly, his mind racing. Just the house settling, he thought, but the doubt in his mind lingered. He needed to get a grip. The painting was an oddity, yes, but it wasn't cursed. Yet the more he stood there, alone with it, the harder it became to convince himself. The shadow on the canvas. The whisper. The chilling sensation that had crept over him like an invisible hand. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something else. Soft footsteps, too faint to be heard clearly, but definitely there. And they were moving not from outside, but from within the room. Nathaniel turned toward the source of the sound, his pulse quickening. His gaze fell once more on the painting. The shadow had shifted again, now much closer to the woman in the foreground. It was no longer subtle, it was obvious. And it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure, hunched and obscured, its form beginning to emerge from the darkness of the background. It looked like something crawling, something long and twisted, as though it were trying to claw its way out of the painting. Nathaniel staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. His hand was shaking, his mind racing, trying to process what he was seeing. He knew what was happening, at least in theory. This had to be some sort of illusion, some kind of psychological trick. But as the figure continued to creep forward, its grotesque limbs stretching toward the edges of the canvas, there was no denying it. Something was alive within the painting. The woman's face twisted, her eyes now wide, desperate. It was as if she was trying to scream, but the sound was trapped within the canvas, just beyond Nathaniel's reach. The air grew colder, and he felt a faint pressure on his chest, as if the painting itself was pulling him in. A sudden, sharp crack split the air. The painting, it was beginning to tear. Nathaniel snapped into action. His instincts kicked in, and he yanked the canvas off the wall completely, throwing it down onto the hardwood floor. The figure in the painting was now gone, but the air was still thick with the chill of its presence. Panting, Nathaniel stumbled backward, his mind whirling. He needed to destroy it. He had to burn it. He had to. Before he could take another step, the lights in the study flickered. For a split second, everything went dark. And then, the whisper returned. "Help me." Nathaniel's heart hammered in his chest. The voice, no. The presence was no longer confined to the painting. It was in the room, surrounding him. The shadows on the walls writhed, and the temperature plummeted. A moment of silence. And then, in the corner of the room, a shape took form. It was her, the woman from the painting. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched the shape coalesce before him. The woman, the one from the painting, stood in the corner of the room, her figure pale and translucent, yet somehow solid enough to make the air around her tremble with an otherworldly energy. Her eyes, dark and hollow, fixed on him. The emptiness in them was more profound than it had been in the painting. Now they were filled with something else, something desperate. She took a slow step forward, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor, and Nathaniel's heart raced in his chest, each beat a thunderous reminder that he was not alone. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt like lead, unwilling to obey. His mouth was dry, and all he could do was stare as she moved closer, her body shimmering faintly like smoke, her pale, disheveled hair drifting around her like tendrils of mist. The whispers began again. "Help me." The voice was clearer now, more urgent, and the chill in the air intensified. The temperature had dropped so low that Nathaniel could see his breath in front of him, fogging up the space around him. He tried to step back, but the woman's presence seemed to pull him in, to trap him in the room. "WH, what do you want?" Nathaniel's voice was barely a whisper, cracking with fear. Her lips parted, and for a terrifying moment, Nathaniel thought she might speak. But instead, her gaze flickered toward the painting lying on the floor. It was as if she was pointing to it without actually moving, the connection between her and the artwork undeniable. Her voice came again, softer this time, but filled with so much sorrow that Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. "Help me. Release me." The room seemed to grow darker as the shadows around her deepened. The woman's figure flickered in and out of focus like a ghost on the edge of perception. The whispers were no longer just her voice. They were a chorus now, swirling around him from every corner of the room. They sounded distant and hollow, as if coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. Nathaniel tried to take another step back, but his feet were glued to the floor. His body trembled, his muscles locked in place, and all he could do was watch as she reached out, her hand now mere inches from him. The shadows seemed to crawl across the walls, stretching toward the woman, bending toward her as though they were alive, obeying her will. They curled around her fingers like tendrils, dark and thick. As she reached for him, the air grew even colder, so cold it hurt. His breath formed frosty clouds in front of his face. "Please," Nathaniel whispered, his voice shaking. He didn't know who he was pleading with, her or himself. "What do you want from me?" Her hand hovered just above his chest now, and for a brief moment, he thought he could see a flicker of something almost human in her expression. It was as if she were trying to speak to him, trying to tell him something vital, something beyond her reach. And then, without warning, the pressure on his chest intensified. The air in the room seemed to shift, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, a storm of voices echoing in his head. The room spun as if the world itself was tilting on its axis. The shadows enveloped him, clinging to him like a suffocating blanket. "No," Nathaniel gasped, his voice barely audible above the growing cacophony. "No, I don't, please." The shadows surged forward, and for a fleeting moment, everything went black. Nathaniel jolted awake, gasping for breath, his body drenched in cold sweat. His eyes darted around the room, but he was no longer standing in the study. He was lying in his bed, the familiar surroundings of his mansion, now seemingly too quiet, too still. The clock on the wall ticked softly in the background, the only sound in the otherwise peaceful room. His heart was racing, and for a long moment, he couldn't even make sense of what had just happened. Had it all been a dream? The painting? The woman? The whispers? But no, he could still feel the chill in his bones, the weight of her presence. He could still hear the faint echo of her voice in his mind. "Help me. Release me." Nathaniel rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the sense of dread that clung to him like a shadow. It was just a nightmare, just his mind playing tricks on him. He was tired, perhaps too exhausted from the events of the day. But then something caught his eye. The painting. It was sitting at the foot of his bed, the frame propped against the wooden floor. Its presence was undeniable, though it was wrapped in the same velvet cloth it had been in at the auction. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. How had it gotten here? His breath hitched as he reached for the painting. His fingers trembled as he unwrapped the cloth slowly, afraid of what he might see. The canvas was cold to the touch, colder than it had been before. He hesitated, but curiosity gnawed at him, pulling him in. And as the final folds of the cloth fell away, his breath caught in his throat once again. The woman was there, on the canvas, staring out at him with the same hollow eyes, her face twisted in terror. But this time, her lips were no longer sealed. They were open, but only one word escaped. "Help!" Nathaniel's eyes widened in horror as he watched the shadows around her begin to shift once more, crawling toward him, as though the woman were about to speak directly to him. And then, the room went completely dark. The darkness was absolute. Nathaniel's heart thudded painfully in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to flee, but his legs wouldn't obey. His breath was shallow, his mind a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. The shadows in the room pressed in, closing around him like a living thing, suffocating him with their weight. What is happening? He couldn't see anything, not even his own hands in front of his face. The only thing he could hear was the pounding of his heart and the soft, barely audible whisper of the woman's voice. "Help me." It was close now, close enough that he could feel it, feel her voice vibrating in the air around him, like it was coming from within him. The air turned frigid, every breath he took feeling like he was inhaling ice. He could see the faintest of shapes beginning to materialize in the darkness. The outline of the woman's form starting to emerge once more, her figure half-formed and flickering like a candle caught in the wind. Then a low, almost imperceptible scrape echoed through the room, followed by the creak of the floorboards, soft, deliberate, like someone was walking toward him. He wasn't alone. Nathaniel tried to move, tried to reach for the light switch, but his hands couldn't find the wall, couldn't find the door. The shadows had completely disoriented him, pulling him deeper into the room, into the suffocating presence of the painting that he had foolishly brought into his life. "Please." The whisper was no longer soft, but insistent, a plea that echoed through the room with growing desperation. He staggered forward, his hands outstretched, searching blindly. Then, suddenly, the shadows parted. The woman was standing in front of him, her face inches from his own. The coldness radiating from her was unbearable. Her eyes, black as pitch, stared into his with an intensity that felt like it was drilling into his soul. Her mouth, now wide open, stretched in a grotesque, impossible way. "Help me." Nathaniel couldn't speak. He was paralyzed, his body trembling, frozen in place by the sheer horror of what stood before him. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Her hands reached toward him, fingers long and skeletal, trembling with the same desperation that filled her eyes. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper now, ragged with fear. "Free me." Nathaniel's mind spun, his chest tightening with an unexplainable sense of dread. What did she want from him? What was he supposed to do? He wanted to run, wanted to get away, but something was holding him there. Something about the woman's gaze was pulling him in, urging him to listen, to understand. He tried to speak, his voice shaking, barely audible. "How? How do I help you?" Her lips curled into a twisted smile, her expression both pleading and mocking. "Destroy it," she breathed, and her voice, though weak, reverberated through the air as if the words were coming from everywhere at once. Destroy it before it's too late. The room around Nathaniel seemed to tremble. He felt the walls closing in, the oppressive weight of the shadows growing heavier with every passing second. His eyes fell to the painting once again. It lay at the foot of his bed, its edges frayed, its canvas warped. The woman's figure was still frozen in her tortured pose, her face twisted in agony, her hand outstretched toward him. But now, there was something more. The background, the one stark shadowy space, seemed to move in ways it shouldn't. The swirling darkness appeared to be alive, growing and shifting, as though it were about to swallow everything. His breath caught in his throat as a thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. The painting, it wasn't just a painting. It was a prison. The woman in the painting had been trapped there for how long? And now, the shadows, the curse, it was spreading into the world outside. Into his world. "Destroy it, or it will take you too," the woman rasped, her voice desperate, her features distorting even further. And with that, she began to dissolve, her form crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers, disappearing into the darkness with a final, agonized scream. Nathaniel staggered backward, breathing raggedly. His heart pounded in his ears. The painting. He had to destroy the painting. But even as the woman's figure faded from his sight, the darkness did not. It clung to him, pressing in, as though the shadows themselves were alive, feeding off his fear. He grabbed the cloth from the floor and threw it over the painting, covering it once more. It was all he could do to shield himself from its malignant influence. But even under the cloth, the oppressive atmosphere in the room remained. The whispers continued, soft and insistent. "Help me." Nathaniel's thoughts were a frantic blur. He couldn't stay here. He needed to get away. He needed to destroy the painting. But first, he needed to understand what had happened. How had this curse come into his hands? Why him? Without another thought, he grabbed the painting, cloth and all, and raced down the stairs into the grand hall. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't let it control him. He would burn it, throw it into the fire, and be done with it. But as he passed through the front door, about to reach the porch where the fire pit lay waiting, a sudden, sharp voice rang out from behind him. "Don't!" Nathaniel froze, his blood turning to ice. He slowly turned around. There, standing in the doorway of his study, was Gregory, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. The words had come from him, but his expression, it wasn't just fear. It was knowing. Gregory stepped forward slowly, his voice quiet but urgent. "You don't understand. You can't destroy it. You don't know what you're dealing with." Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat as Gregory's words echoed in the quiet of the hall. The fire pit seemed miles away now, the warmth and safety it promised slipping further out of reach. "You don't understand," Gregory repeated, his voice low, tinged with fear. "You can't just destroy it. You don't know what it will cost." Nathaniel stared at him, disbelief flooding his chest. "What are you talking about?" His voice shook with a mix of confusion and frustration. "This thing, this curse, it's real. It's been coming after me, pulling me in. I saw it, Gregory. I saw her. I can't let it take me too. I have to destroy it." Gregory's face twisted with something that was almost regret, and he stepped forward, blocking Nathaniel's path to the door. "You can't just get rid of it like you would a normal object. It's not that simple." Nathaniel's mind raced. What was Gregory saying? He had never seen his friend this frantic before. This wasn't just about the painting, it was about something more. He stepped back, clutching the wrapped painting closer to his chest. "I don't care what it takes. I'll burn it, throw it into the fire, and be done with it. If I don't, I'm next. You saw it too. You felt it. It's already reached me." Gregory shook his head slowly, his eyes haunted. "You don't understand. The painting, the curse, it feeds off your fear, your desperation. The more you try to destroy it, the stronger it gets. It's bound to you now, and the only way to stop it." He broke off abruptly, swallowing hard, as if the words were too difficult to say. His voice dropped to a whisper. "The only way to stop it is to release it. Let it consume you. It can only be freed when it takes you. That's the price." Nathaniel stared at him, trying to make sense of what Gregory was saying. "What do you mean, release it? You're telling me I have to let it take me?" "Yes." Gregory's voice was barely audible, as if the words were too dangerous to say out loud. "You have to let it do what it came here to do. It's already in you. You can't fight it." The room felt colder as Gregory's words settled in. The painting, the woman, she was still alive, still clawing at the edges of Nathaniel's reality, waiting for him to give in. Nathaniel felt his legs weaken beneath him. The weight of the decision hung over him like a guillotine, and his mind was a whirlwind of horror and disbelief. He had never believed in curses, in the supernatural. But everything had changed the moment he laid eyes on that painting. He looked down at the cloth in his hands, then back at Gregory, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "No, I can't. I won't let it win. There has to be another way." Gregory stepped closer, his face filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "There isn't. You have to accept it. The more you resist, the more you'll suffer. It's already in your mind. in your blood. It will follow you no matter where you go, no matter what you do, unless you release it. The tension in the room thickened, the silence pressing in on Nathaniel from all sides. He could still feel the cold creeping along his skin, the faint whispers of the woman echoing in his ears. Her voice was louder now, as though she were right behind him. "Help me." The words twisted in his mind, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if they were coming from Gregory or from somewhere else entirely. Nathaniel's hands clenched around the painting, his knuckles white. His thoughts raced. He couldn't just let it consume him. He couldn't. But Gregory's face was pale, his eyes full of something dark and knowing. "I tried to fight it too," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I thought I could get rid of it, but I couldn't. The more I fought, the more it destroyed me. It will destroy you too, if you try." Nathaniel felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His mind was reeling. What was he supposed to do? The painting, it had to be the key. But was it worth the cost? Could he really let himself be consumed by it? Could he release something so dangerous, so dark into the world? The whisper grew louder. "Help me. Release me." Suddenly, a thought pierced through the fog of his fear. "What happens if I don't release it?" Nathaniel asked, his voice hoarse. Gregory's face paled even further, his eyes flickering to the doorway, as though he were afraid of someone hearing the words. "If you don't release it." He began slowly, as though the words themselves were a death sentence. "It will destroy you. It will pull you into the painting. It will become a part of you, and your soul will be trapped there forever." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. "Trapped?" Gregory nodded, his voice trembling. "Yes, you'll become like her. A ghost in the painting. A prisoner." Nathaniel's grip tightened on the cloth. He glanced at the door, his mind torn between the fear of what was to come and the deep, gnawing need to end it all. But as he stood there, frozen, the whispers swelled to a fever pitch, overwhelming him. "Help me. Release me." The cold was unbearable now. It was as though the very air was alive with a woman's presence, pressing in on him on sides. And then something happened. The painting, it began to tremble. It vibrated in his hands, as though it were alive, pulling at him. The cloth covering it fluttered, and for a moment, Nathaniel thought he saw something move within the folds, something shifting just beyond his sight. Before he could react, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. And that's when he heard it. The softest sound, like a slow, deliberate whisper coming from the painting. "Release. Me." Nathaniel's pulse hammered in his ears, his fingers trembling around the wrapped painting as the door slammed shut behind him. He could hear his breath, shallow and ragged, as the whispers became a constant hum in his mind. The cold was unbearable, crawling under his skin like ice, suffocating him. "Release. Me." The voice was softer now, like a sigh on the wind, but it felt closer, more urgent, pressing against his chest with every passing second. The shadows in the room seemed to twist, to dance, as though the very air around him was alive and reaching, hungry. He could feel it. He could feel her, the woman from the painting. Her presence was suffocating, her demands pulling at him from all sides. "Help me." Gregory stepped closer, his face pale, his hands outstretched as if to hold Nathaniel back. "You don't understand, Nathaniel. It's too late. You can't fight this. You need to let go." Nathaniel's chest tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might choke on his own breath. His mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of what Gregory had said, what had happened, how everything had gone so horribly wrong, so quickly. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to break free from the nightmare surrounding him. He could feel the pull of the painting, its dark energy weaving its way into his thoughts. "Let go," Nathaniel repeated, his voice hoarse, his eyes wild with panic. "You want me to just give in? You want me to become like her?" His gaze darted toward the wrapped painting. Like that. Gregory's face twisted with a strange, pained expression, a mixture of guilt and sorrow. You don't have a choice. It's already here. It's inside you now. And the more you fight it, the more it will take. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening. The whispers rose in volume, and Nathaniel felt his resolve begin to fracture, the oppressive force of the curse closing in around him. Help me. The voice was louder now, stronger. The painting, it was no longer just a piece of art. It was a portal, a doorway to something far worse. The woman's eyes seemed to bore into Nathaniel's very soul, the shadows swirling around her, clawing at the edges of reality. Nathaniel's breath came in short, ragged bursts. He could hear his own heartbeat, faster and faster, as if time itself was speeding up. What? What if I don't? He gasped. What happens if I don't release it, Gregory? Tell me the truth. Gregory's face was grim, his voice barely above a whisper. If you don't let it go, it will devour you. Your soul will be trapped inside the painting. You will become part of it. A prisoner in the shadows, lost to eternity. A cold chill washed over Nathaniel. His blood ran cold as the words sank in, and for a long moment, the room felt like it was closing in on him. He looked at the painting, the swirling shadows within it, and felt a strange, sickening pull. It was already too late. Release. Me. The voice was almost pleading now, and the painting seemed to tremble in his hands once more, as if alive. The shadows behind it shifted, writhing and twisting like a living thing, reaching toward him with an insatiable hunger. Nathaniel stumbled backward, his legs weak, his mind a whirl of panic and disbelief. The weight of it all was unbearable, the knowledge that he was facing something far beyond his understanding, something ancient and malevolent. No. He shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. I won't be its prisoner. I won't let it take me. He turned toward Gregory, his eyes desperate. You said it was inside me now. How do I stop it? Tell me how to get rid of it. Please. Gregory looked torn, as if the answer he wanted to give Nathaniel would come at an impossible cost. His voice was barely a whisper. You can't stop it. Not without paying the price. You must choose either release it or let it consume you. If you try to destroy it, it will drag you into the painting and you'll never return. Nathaniel shook his head, his mind a frantic blur of confusion. His fingers clenched around the cloth once more. I can't just let it win. I can't be part of it. There has to be another way. Gregory stepped forward, placing a hand on Nathaniel's trembling shoulder, his eyes filled with sorrow and something darker, something that was realization. There is no other way, Gregory said softly. It wants you, Nathaniel, and if you don't let it have you, it will make you regret it. It's not a choice anymore. It's inevitable. Nathaniel's breath quickened. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, the shadows pressing in tighter. He was trapped. The curse was upon him, and he didn't know how to escape it. Suddenly, the shadows in the room grew still, a strange silence falling over the house. Nathaniel froze, feeling as though the world had stopped for a heartbeat. And then, with a sound that was too quiet to be real, the painting began to unravel. The cloth around the edges of the canvas began to rip, the fabric tearing as if it were made of paper. The shadows behind the painting swirled and reached outward, stretching like tendrils into the room. The air grew thick with tension, and the very light in the room seemed to dim, as though something was blocking it from inside. Release me. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a demand that Nathaniel could not ignore. The canvas itself seemed to ripple, and before Nathaniel could react, a figure began to emerge from it, slowly at first, but then faster, more forcefully. The woman's form stepped forward, her eyes locked onto him with a hunger that was both terrifying and captivating. Nathaniel's heart stopped. He couldn't breathe. There she was, standing before him, her mouth parted in an agonized scream. Her body was no longer contained within the frame of the painting. She was here, in his world, a nightmare made flesh. You, she gasped, her voice rasping with malevolent hunger. You are the one who must set me free. Nathaniel took a step back, his body trembling with a primal fear. The air around him was thick with an unnatural chill. His body refused to move, as though the woman's presence was holding him in place, rooting him to the spot. And then, from the darkness behind her, he saw something far worse. Another shape, emerging from the shadows, something that moved with a speed he couldn't comprehend. A figure that was not human. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat as the shadow behind the woman began to take shape. It moved unnaturally fast, its form bending and twisting as if it were made of smoke and darkness. Something other. It wasn't human. It was something far older, far more malevolent. The air around it seemed to hum with an energy that felt alive, that felt hungry. The woman's hollow eyes locked onto Nathaniel, her mouth twisting into a cruel, jagged grin. "You must set me free," she whispered again, her voice sickeningly sweet, as if coaxing him toward his doom. But the figure in the shadows was moving closer, growing more solid, more real with every second. Nathaniel's body screamed for him to move, but his legs were frozen in place, as though the shadows themselves were rooting him to the floor. "Please," the woman's voice hissed, her figure flickering in and out of focus, her form unstable like a flame struggling against the wind. "Help me. Set me free, Nathaniel. You have no choice." He couldn't tear his gaze away from her. He wanted to scream, to run, but it was as if her very presence had stolen his ability to think, to act. The whispers, her words, they wrapped around his mind like a vice, squeezing the very willpower from his body. The figure behind her, the thing that wasn't human, was closer now. Nathaniel could see its eyes, two glowing, blood-red orbs that seemed to pierce the darkness with an unnatural intensity. It was all teeth and claws, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch and shift with each movement. Its face an abomination of shadows and malice. Gregory stepped back, his face pale and full of terror. "No, Nathaniel," he gasped. "You can't. It's here. It's coming for both of us now." The figure lunged. Nathaniel's heart leapt into his throat. Instinct kicked in, and he finally found his legs, backing away, but the shadows followed, moving faster than he could run. The room seemed to close in around him, the darkness growing thicker, swallowing everything in its path. The woman's form flickered again, and Nathaniel barely managed to tear his eyes away from her. But as he looked back to the thing in the shadows, it was already too late. It was on him. Its claws, long and twisted, scraped the floor, screeching like metal against stone as it slashed toward him. Nathaniel stumbled backward, barely avoiding the swipe, his heart racing in his chest. The air was suffocating, thick with the stench of decay and something far more ancient and horrible. "It's too late." Gregory's voice trembled as he watched from the corner. "You should have let it go, Nathaniel. You should have released it." Nathaniel's mind screamed at him to act. The painting, it had to be the key. But what Gregory had said, what he knew, kept running through his mind. You can't fight it, not without paying the price. His hands shook, sweat dripping down his face, his throat dry. The figure moved toward him again, its red eyes burning with fury. He was trapped, the walls closing in, the shadows creeping, pulling him into their depths. And then, without thinking, he did the only thing that made sense in the chaotic fog of his fear and desperation. He threw the painting. It flew from his hands, the cloth tearing as it sailed through the air. The moment it hit the ground, the room seemed to tremble, the air vibrating with an oppressive energy. The shadows recoiled, and the figure, the thing, paused, its claws hovering in midair, as if unsure what had just happened. The woman's form flickered again, but this time there was something different in her expression. Her face twisted in horror, her eyes wide with realization. "No," she screamed, her voice desperate and broken. "What have you done?" Nathaniel's pulse raced. He didn't know what he had just done. He didn't know if it was the right choice, if there even was a right choice. But the way the thing had stopped, it gave him a flicker of hope. He turned to Gregory, who was watching with wide eyes. "What's happening?" Gregory didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the painting, his face pale, his lips trembling. Then his voice came out in a whisper, barely audible over the growing hum of energy in the room. You triggered it," he said, his voice full of horror. "You've awakened the full curse." Nathaniel's heart sank. What? What do you mean? What did I do?" Gregory's eyes were wide with terror, and he backed away slowly, his gaze fixed on the painting. "It's not just a curse," he whispered. "It's an anchor. The painting, she is a vessel for something much older, much darker. By releasing it, you've opened the floodgates." Nathaniel looked back at the painting. It was lying on the floor now, the cloth torn and ragged, the canvas exposed. The swirling shadows within seemed to writhe, as though the darkness was struggling to break free. The figure in the room, whatever it was, shifted again, its eyes gleaming brighter now, its form more solid, more real. Gregory said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this. Not unless." A loud crash sounded from behind Nathaniel, followed by a deafening roar. The floor shook beneath them, and the room seemed to split in half as something huge collided with the walls. Nathaniel spun around, panic rising in his chest. The walls themselves were cracking, splintering under the force of something unseen. "Run!" Gregory shouted. "Now!" The room felt like it was falling apart. Nathaniel didn't wait to hear anymore. He bolted toward the door, but as he reached it, the air grew thick and oppressive. He could feel it, feel them pressing in on him, reaching toward him with long, dark tendrils, ready to drag him back into the painting, into the void. The woman's voice, now guttural and furious, echoed through the house. "You can't escape. You can't outrun what you've unleashed." Nathaniel's mind screamed. He had to get out. He had to survive. But as the door slammed open, he realized he had only just begun to understand the horror of what he had set in motion. And it was far from over. Nathaniel's legs burned as he sprinted toward the door, his pulse roaring in his ears. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch out toward him like claws, reaching for his skin, for his soul. The air thickened, suffocating him, but he pushed forward, his heart hammering with terror. The moment his hand touched the doorknob, a force like cold steel slammed into his chest. He was thrown backward, crashing into the floor with a sickening thud. The breath was knocked out of him, and for a moment, all he could do was lay there, gasping, his body refusing to move. From the corner of his eye, he saw the figure, the thing that had emerged from the shadows. It was closer now, its red eyes glowing brighter than before, its twisted claws scraping across the floor with an unholy screech. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You're already part of it, already mine." Nathaniel scrambled to his feet, but the thing was moving too quickly. It lunged, its claws slashing the air in front of him. He ducked, barely avoiding the deadly swipe. But as he looked up, he saw the painting still lying on the floor, its torn cloth fluttering as though alive, its shadows writhing. "Help me," the woman's voice called again, this time not pleading, but commanding. Her image flickered in and out of focus, her eyes locked onto Nathaniel's, filled with a hunger that twisted his insides. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't outrun the thing, couldn't escape the painting. The very walls of the room were bending and shifting, as though reality itself was being reshaped by the curse he had unleashed. Behind him, Gregory was backing toward the far corner of the room, his face pale, his hands shaking as he muttered something under his breath, an incantation, perhaps, or a prayer. But whatever he was doing, it wasn't enough. The air was thick with malevolent energy, and the room was falling apart around them. "Gregory!" Nathaniel shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "What do we do now?" He had to do something. Anything, but nothing made sense. Gregory's eyes were wide with terror, his voice barely audible. It's too late. You've opened the floodgates. The curse, the painting, it's never just one. It wants more. It feeds off the fear, the darkness. He paused, his gaze flicking nervously toward the shadows that had begun to pour out of the canvas. You can't stop it by running. You have to. But before he could finish, the ground beneath their feet trembled with a violent roar. The walls of the room cracked open, splintering with an unnatural force. Nathaniel barely had time to react as the air shifted. Something was coming from the cracks in the walls, something alive. The thing in the painting was no longer alone. More shadows, more twisted figures began to crawl through the fissures, their bodies contorting unnaturally as they slipped into the room. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest as he turned and stumbled back toward the window. The glass was already cracked, jagged edges shimmering in the dim light. He had to get out. He couldn't stay in this place any longer. There was no choice. The door was blocked. The walls were closing in. His only escape was through the window. But as he rushed toward it, his breath coming in shallow gasps, the woman's voice suddenly filled his mind again, louder than ever before. You can't escape me, Nathaniel. You are mine now. He froze, his hand inches from the window, and for a moment, all he could do was stare at the broken glass, unable to move, unable to think. He felt the pull of the painting, felt it sink into his. So like roots digging deep into his body. Her voice, the whispers, they were part of him now. The shadows that had once only haunted the corners of his vision were now inescapable, wrapping themselves around him like a blanket of ice. And then he heard it, a sound that was so soft, so sinister, that it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. A laugh. It was high-pitched and mocking, echoing around the room, bouncing off the cracked walls. The woman's image began to solidify, becoming more real, her figure pulling itself from the painting, her form shimmering in the shadows. The air crackled with a dark energy, a presence that threatened to tear the room apart. Gregory screamed, his voice breaking with desperation. Nathaniel, you have to listen. You can't run. But before he could finish, the ground split open beneath him. Nathaniel barely had time to react before the floor beneath Gregory gave way, a massive crack widening along the length of the room. The sound of splintering wood and grinding stone echoed in Nathaniel's ears as Gregory was swallowed by the darkness that rushed up from the crack. No, Nathaniel screamed, rushing toward the spot where Gregory had fallen. But it was too late. The shadows had already claimed him. His friend was gone. As the crack continued to widen, the room seemed to grow colder, the air more oppressive. The woman, now fully free from the confines of the painting, stepped toward Nathaniel, her smile twisted and cruel. You should have listened, she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. You've unleashed everything now. It will never end. Nathaniel's mind reeled. He had made a mistake. He had believed that if he destroyed the painting, if he got rid of it, it would be over. But now he saw the truth. This wasn't just a curse, it was a prison, a trap that stretched across time and space, pulling in anyone who dared get too close. And it wasn't just the woman. There were others, figures from the shadows, things that lurked beyond the veil of reality, waiting for the moment they could slip through and claim their victims. He backed away from her slowly, his thoughts racing. He had no time. He had no answers. The only thing he knew was that he had to survive. But as he turned, the room seemed to shift again, the walls closing in on him. He was trapped. You can't escape, the woman hissed, her form growing larger, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. You never could. Nathaniel stumbled backward into the corner, his mind spinning with fear and despair. He reached out, desperate for anything that might give him an advantage, but everything was slipping away. The shadows were swallowing him whole. The cracks in the walls were widening, and he could feel the darkness closing in around him. And then, as if on cue, the painting began to glow. The painting's glow intensified, a sickly, otherworldly light spilling from the canvas. It was as though the shadows inside it were alive, pulling every ounce of light into their depths, feeding off of it. The darkness in the room grew more oppressive, crawling along the walls, twisting like serpents. Nathaniel felt his breath catch in his throat, his heart pounding wildly as the woman's form grew larger, more monstrous. Her eyes locked onto his, glowing with an unnatural intensity. "You cannot escape," she whispered, her voice no longer sweet, but guttural, a growl that sent chills down his spine. "I was bound in that painting, but now I am free, and I will take everything you are." Nathaniel's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor, his mind screaming for him to run, but his body refused to obey. He looked toward the door, toward the window, but they were both engulfed in darkness now, a void of despair. The room was no longer a room. It was a prison, an endless chasm of shadows closing in on him from every angle. He could hear the whispers again. The voices, the ones that had been so distant at first, were now a cacophony, clawing at his mind, suffocating him. "Help me, Nathaniel. Set me free." They weren't just from the woman. There were others, dozens, maybe hundreds, each voice an echo from the painting, a trapped soul, clawing, begging to be released. But there was no escape. He could feel it. The curse was inside him now, twisting and warping his thoughts, his very being. He was part of it, just as Gregory had said. His soul was bound to the painting now, bound to the woman who had once been trapped in it, but who had now been set loose by his own foolishness. The room seemed to close in tighter. The walls were melting, the ceiling distorting, and in every direction, shadows were gathering. The woman's form swayed in the air, her body shifting like smoke, her eyes now filled with hunger. "You think you can stop this?" she hissed. "You think you can run?" The floor beneath him trembled as if the house itself were alive, responding to the curse, feeding off the terror that radiated from Nathaniel's very soul. He staggered to his feet, his mind in a haze, but then the glow from the painting became blinding, and he staggered back, shielding his eyes. For a brief moment, he felt an intense heat, a burning sensation, like his body was being pulled toward the painting. He glanced toward the back of the room, where the crack in the floor had swallowed Gregory. The ground had sealed over, but the crack was still visible in his mind, a scar, a wound that hadn't healed. It had taken Gregory, just like it had taken others before him. It was waiting, hungry, and then the shadows began to whisper again, but this time the voice was unmistakable. Gregory. Nathaniel froze. He could feel his friend's presence. He didn't know how, but somehow Gregory's soul had lingered, caught between worlds, trapped in the in-between, in the cursed space the painting had created. "Gregory," Nathaniel called out, his voice shaking. "Is that you? Help me," the voice whispered, broken and faint. I am here, Nathaniel. It won't let me go. It's too strong. It's too late for me." Nathaniel's heart raced. He didn't know what to do, where to go. The woman's form shifted again, and the room seemed to grow colder, the darkness deepening. The whispers from the painting were overwhelming, pressing into his skull, filling his head with 1,000 voices. "You're mine now," the woman cooed, her voice both soothing and terrifying. "You belong to me, Nathaniel, and I will make sure you never leave." Her words became a melody, a dark lullaby that tugged at the corners of his mind, making it impossible to think clearly. The whispers blurred together, blending into a single unholy chant. "Gregory, what should I do?" Nathaniel begged, his voice almost a sob. "Tell me, how do I stop this?" There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling energy in the room. Then Gregory's voice came again, but this time it was distant, filled with fear. "There is no stopping it." Gregory's voice echoed, breaking, unless you destroy the painting. Nathaniel's chest tightened. Destroy the painting? But he had already tried, hadn't he? He had thrown it. But it hadn't stopped the curse. It had only set it free. It had released something much worse than he could ever have imagined. No, you don't understand, Gregory continued, his voice trembling. You have to destroy the painting while you're still in it. You have to pull it back in. It's the only way to stop it. You have to. Sacrifice yourself to seal it again. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. Sacrifice himself? For what? To save his own soul? To save anyone else? But he realized, as the shadows closed in around him, that there might be no other choice. The painting glowed again, this time brighter, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed as if alive. It was pulling at him, dragging him back toward it, and the woman's form grew larger, her monstrous silhouette dominating the room. No! Nathaniel screamed, his hands reaching toward the painting, even as his mind screamed to run. I won't become part of it. I won't. But the shadows tugged at his feet, pulling him in. He felt the runes spinning, the ground slipping from beneath him. The glow of the painting was overwhelming now, filling his vision with its light and darkness, blurring the line between what was real and what was cursed. Then, without warning, his body lurched forward, and he felt the pull. The curse was claiming him. The woman whispered, her voice a chorus of many. Sacrifice, Nathaniel. He fought it with every ounce of strength he had left, but the shadows surged toward him, wrapping around his arms, his legs, pulling him into the center of the room. And as the last of the light flickered out, he realized he had no way of knowing if his sacrifice would even be enough. The shadows wrapped around Nathaniel, pulling him closer to the glowing painting, as if the very fabric of reality were bending to the will of the curse. His skin burned where the darkness touched him, a searing cold that gnawed at his bones. The whispers, now a cacophony, filled his ears, overwhelming his thoughts, drowning out all sense of reason. Sacrifice. The voice came again, this time mocking, cruel. 1,000 voices layered together, all belonging to those who had been trapped within the painting before him. Each voice had a different tone, but they all carried the same message. You belong to me now. Nathaniel's chest heaved as the darkness continued to pull him in. He could see the woman now, her form flickering like a warped reflection in a broken mirror. Her eyes glowed with malice, her smile stretching unnaturally wide, her teeth jagged and sharp like a predator's. You cannot escape, she said, her voice honey-sweet, but dripping with venom. You never could, not once you crossed into my world. You should have never found that painting. Her words cut through him deep and cold, reminding him of every mistake, every misstep that had led him here. The painting, the house, the curse, everything had brought him to this moment. He struggled to breathe as the shadows tightened around him, choking the air from his lungs. His vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented, and for a moment, he felt his sanity begin to slip away, just like Gregory's. Sacrifice. Gregory's voice echoed in his mind again, distant and desperate. You have to destroy it while you're still in it. Nathaniel's eyes flicked to the painting. The glowing canvas beckoned him, and as much as he wanted to resist, he could feel the pull, a magnetic force stronger than anything he had ever known. The painting was alive, and it wanted him. It wanted all of him. His heart hammered in his chest, his hands trembling, but a part of him, deep, buried under the terror, knew that Gregory was right. If he didn't end it now, if he didn't destroy the painting while he was inside it, the curse would consume him completely. He would become nothing more than another voice, another soul trapped forever within its walls. He took a step forward, his body fighting against the oppressive weight of the shadows, but his will stronger now, driven by the desperate need to survive, to stop it. His hands reached out, trembling for the edges of the glowing canvas. No, the woman shrieked, her form growing larger, more monstrous. You cannot. You will not escape. But Nathaniel didn't listen. He didn't have time to listen. He had to act. With every ounce of strength left in him, he lunged toward the painting, his fingers brushing against the glowing fabric. The moment he touched it, the shadows seemed to roar, a deafening scream that tore through the air, making his skull ache, his bones rattle. The light from the painting flared brightly, blinding him, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't pull away. The moment his fingers made contact, a shockwave of energy slammed into him, blasting him backward with a force so powerful it cracked the walls, causing the ceiling to splinter and crumble. He landed hard on the floor, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. Everything around him was spinning. The room seemed to stretch and twist, as though reality itself was unraveling. He could feel the painting's power, its hunger, gnawing at him, pulling at him like a vortex. The woman's voice was everywhere, her whispers seeping into his mind, urging him to give in, to surrender. "It's too late for you," she hissed. "You belong to me. Your soul is mine." But Nathaniel's body was burning. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't stop them. The shadows were consuming him, dragging him into the painting. But in the back of his mind, a single thought pierced through the chaos. He had to sacrifice. He had to return to the painting to trap it. The walls of the room collapsed, the floor giving way beneath him. And for a moment, everything felt weightless, like he was falling, floating through the void. He could hear the woman's voice, closer now, breathing down his neck, a cold whisper. "Join me, Nathaniel. Let me take you into the dark." But then something shifted. The shadows began to recede, shrinking back from the edges of the room. The light from the painting flickered, growing dim. Nathaniel's body trembled, the pull on his soul growing weaker, not stronger. In that instant, something inside him clicked. He realized what he had to do. He wasn't just supposed to destroy the painting. He had to take it back into himself. He had to trap the darkness within his own soul to stop it from spreading. His heart pounded. There was no going back. No second chances. Nathaniel pushed himself to his feet, his limbs heavy with exhaustion, his body aching. He stumbled toward the painting, his breath shallow, every muscle screaming in pain. The shadows clawed at him, trying to drag him back, but he fought them off, determined to finish what he had started. He reached for the edges of the painting once more. This time, he didn't hesitate. The moment his hands touched the fabric, everything went black. The darkness wrapped around him like a suffocating cocoon. It was cold, so cold. His entire body trembled, but he held on, gripping the edges of the painting with everything he had left. The pull was overwhelming, the weight of the curse pressing down on him, but he couldn't stop. Not now. A scream tore from his throat as the darkness began to consume him, devouring his mind, his body, his very essence. But as the last fragments of his consciousness began to slip away, he felt a strange sensation, like the darkness had become him, merging with him, locking him inside. Then silence. When Nathaniel opened his eyes, he was back in the room. The shadows were gone. The glow from the painting had faded. The oppressive energy that had filled the space was no longer there. He was alone. The room was quiet. The painting, still hanging on the wall, was no longer glowing. It was just a painting, ordinary and lifeless. Nathaniel's breath was shaky as he stood, his body aching, his mind reeling. He reached for his chest, but his hands were trembling too badly. He could still feel the weight of the curse, the weight of the shadows that had consumed him. Had he won, or had he become part of it? Nathaniel stood in the silent room, his body frozen in place. The weight of what he had just experienced pressed heavily on him, but his mind was a blur, unable to comprehend whether he was truly free or whether he had merely exchanged one form of imprisonment for another. The painting, now just a mere relic hanging on the wall, seemed innocuous, almost normal, but he could feel it. He could feel it deep inside him, a pull, a gnawing sensation at the edges of his mind. It wasn't over. It wasn't over at all. He took a step back, his breath shallow. His hands trembled as he reached for the edges of the painting. The brushstrokes were still visible, the colors deep and vibrant, but beneath them there was something else. Something darker, hidden in the cracks. The woman's face seemed to watch him from the canvas, her eyes gleaming with that same malicious hunger. "You can't escape me, Nathaniel." Her voice echoed in his head, soft and insidious. "I will never let you go." His stomach churned. He had felt it. The moment he had sacrificed himself to pull the painting's curse back inside, something had shifted. Something had changed within him. He could still hear the echoes of the trapped souls, the voices, the whispers, all of them clamoring for release. But it was no longer just them he could hear. It was his own voice, too. The connection had been sealed, and the price he paid was not one of freedom. It was something much darker. A quiet breath escaped his lips as he stumbled back, trying to distance himself from the painting. But the room seemed to close in around him. The air was thick, as though it had become heavier, almost suffocating. He felt the walls pressing in, and the corners of the room, once familiar, now seemed alien, distorted. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, trying to force the creeping fear from his chest. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." But the shadows began to shift. Slowly at first, just a flicker at the edges of his vision. Then they grew, expanding outward, undulating like liquid darkness. They crawled along the walls, the ceiling, the floor. He could feel them move, could feel their coldness brushing against his skin. "It's too late," came the voice again, clearer this time, but mixed with others. Thousands of voices, layered together, suffocating his thoughts. "You've taken us all. You've become part of the painting." His eyes widened as he spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were forming shapes, figures, silhouettes of the trapped souls, stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes, each one a reflection of the woman's form, but distorted, monstrous. "No!" Nathaniel screamed, his voice breaking. "No, this can't be real. I'm free. I'm not." Before he could finish, one of the figures lunged forward, its fingers outstretched, cold and skeletal. It was just like the woman, tall with that same cruel smile, but now the smile was jagged, filled with sharp, broken teeth. Its eyes were empty, soulless, and they stared into his very core. The shadow-clad figure reached for him, its long, bony fingers grazing his shoulder. He recoiled in terror, the contact sending a shock of icy cold through him. His skin burned with the sensation, and his heart raced as the room seemed to close in even tighter. "You will never escape, Nathaniel," the figure whispered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. "We are all part of you now." Nathaniel staggered backward, his legs weak, his mind in turmoil. The painting, the sacrifice. It had worked, hadn't it? It had pulled the curse back in, sealed it inside of him. But he hadn't destroyed it. He had become it. The figure's grip tightened, and Nathaniel gasped as the darkness seemed to spread from it, swallowing him whole. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost, suffocated by the shadows that encased him, pulling him into the very fabric of the painting itself. The last thing he saw before his vision blurred and the darkness took him was the woman's face, her twisted smile, her eyes glowing with that same insatiable hunger. He could feel the weight of her gaze, piercing into him, and then blackness. When Nathaniel awoke, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Complete, all-encompassing silence. The air was thick, but it didn't feel heavy like before. It felt still, cold. He opened his eyes, but everything around him was indistinct, a swirling fog of darkness. He couldn't see anything clearly, nothing solid, nothing to anchor him to reality. But he felt something, a pull. The sensation was like a thread, invisible yet strong, tugging at his very core. It was coming from somewhere, inside him. His heart raced as the pull grew stronger, more insistent. His breath quickened, panic beginning to rise. "What's happening?" He whispered to the empty void around him. "Where am I?" The shadows responded, not with sound, but with movement. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, twisted, broken shapes with haunting, faceless forms, all surrounding him. And then, in the center of them, he saw her again, the woman from the painting. She was no longer in the painting. She was here, standing before him, her figure no longer confined to the canvas. She was free, they were all free. "You shouldn't have tried to escape," she said softly, her voice a melody of sweetness and death. "Now we are all part of each other." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He felt them, all of them, the souls, the other voices. They were inside him, coiling around his mind like vines, suffocating him, clawing at the edges of his consciousness. The curse hadn't ended. It had only grown, and now it was a part of him. It was always a part of him. "You're mine now," the woman whispered again, and Nathaniel understood. He had become the painting, and he was no longer just Nathaniel. He was a part of them, and they would never let him go. Nathaniel's chest heaved as he tried to process the horrifying truth. He was no longer alone in his mind. The others, the trapped souls, the shadows, the woman, had become one with him. Each of them was a weight pressing against his consciousness, a constant, suffocating presence. The pull of the painting had consumed him, swallowed him whole, and now he existed within its twisted confines, a part of its endless nightmare. He tried to move, to break free, but his body felt heavy, sluggish. It was as if the darkness had seeped into his very cells, weighing him down from the inside out. His limbs refused to obey him, and his mind was a swirling vortex of voices, whispers, and shadows, all clamoring for attention, for release, for escape. But there was no escape. "Welcome to your new reality," the woman's voice whispered, her form looming in front of him, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "You thought you could destroy me, but you only fed me, Nathaniel. You fed us all." He tried to speak, to ask questions, but his voice was drowned by the cacophony of the others, their voices merging into a single, overwhelming sound. "You are nothing now," the woman continued, her voice sweet yet venomous. "You have become a part of the painting, trapped forever, locked in this world of shadows. The more you struggle, the more you will become us. The more we will consume you." Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Panic surged through him, and he fought to break free of the overwhelming presence that had enveloped him. But no matter how hard he pushed, no matter how fiercely he tried to tear himself away, it was as if the shadows had sunk too deep into his soul, entwining with his very essence. He was losing himself. Suddenly, he felt something stir within him, a memory, a flicker of his old self, a glimpse of the world he had once known. The faces of his family, the sound of laughter, the warmth of sunlight, everything that had been real, everything that had once mattered, seemed so distant now, so unreachable. The more he tried to focus on it, the further it slipped from his grasp. "You'll never feel that warmth again," the woman taunted, her form moving closer, her face a twisted mask of delight. "You've crossed the threshold, Nathaniel. You've entered the painting. You are no longer a part of the world you once knew." He could feel the weight of her words, the truth they carried. He was trapped. He had done it to himself. And the curse was now a part of him. The souls, the woman, they were inside him. He could feel their longing, their hunger, their endless desire for freedom. But there was no way out. There was no light, no escape. Only the darkness. Only the painting. As the woman's form continued to close in on him, her cold fingers brushing against his skin, Nathaniel's mind raced. He knew now that the curse was not just a simple artifact of supernatural horror. It wasn't just a painting, it was a gateway to something far darker. Something ancient. The souls trapped inside the painting were only a fraction of the curse's true power. "You wanted to stop me. the woman said softly, her smile curling cruelly. "But now you're part of me, part of us." Suddenly, a surge of cold energy coursed through Nathaniel's body. His mind screamed in agony as the souls inside him grew more restless, more frantic. He could hear them now, their voices blending into a single, maddened roar. "Help me. Let us go. You can't. Escape." They were all reaching out to him now, pulling at him from within. He could feel his sense of self slipping further away, his identity dissolving into the darkness. The lines between him and the others began to blur. He was no longer Nathaniel. He was them, 1,000 voices, 1,000 souls trapped within the curse. "What have you done?" He whispered, his voice broken. "What have I become?" "You are us now," the woman said, her voice no longer sweet, but guttural, filled with a twisted satisfaction. "And we will never let you go. Not ever." The shadows around him thickened, coiling tighter, suffocating him in their embrace. They were everywhere now, in his skin, in his mind, filling every space, every breath, until he could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and theirs began. And then, with a sudden surge, everything went silent. The darkness around him stilled, and for a brief moment, Nathaniel thought he had finally slipped into unconsciousness. But when he opened his eyes again, he realized he was no longer in the room he had once known. The walls were gone. The painting was gone. He was inside the painting now, trapped within its endless void. The figures, those twisted, broken souls, were all around him. They no longer had faces, only silhouettes, figures that swirled around him in the darkness, their hands reaching out for him, pulling him closer. "You'll never leave," they whispered, their voices now a single, unified chant. "You'll never leave us. You belong to us." Nathaniel tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the void. He tried to move, but his limbs were frozen in place, his body bound by the shadows. And as the souls closed in around him, their whispers growing louder, he understood the terrible truth. He had never escaped. He had never truly been free. Nathaniel had become part of the painting, forever. Nathaniel's mind raced, a torrent of disjointed thoughts and broken fragments, none of them his own. The darkness around him had swallowed his sense of time, his identity, his very soul. He could feel the coldness of the shadow, the weight of the souls that had once been trapped in the painting. But now they were within him, a part of him, clawing and screeching for release, for vengeance. And yet, as he floated in the endless void, the whispers of the souls didn't feel like just voices in his mind. They felt like his own. The fear, the rage, the helplessness. It was all him now. He was the voice of the cursed, a vessel for their suffering, a hollowed-out container filled with nothing but torment. "We are all one," a voice murmured from within, a voice so familiar and yet so foreign. It was his own voice, but it sounded distorted, warped. "You cannot escape. You will never escape. Please," Nathaniel whispered, his voice a mere breath. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." The words hung in the air, swallowed by the darkness, unheard by the empty void that surrounded him. The souls, those once human forms, began to emerge from the inky blackness, their faceless figures swirling in a never-ending spiral around him. They no longer resembled the people they once were. Their forms were mere shadows, their bodies bent and twisted in grotesque ways. Some had no limbs at all, others were hunched and broken. Their features were an unreadable mess of darkness and pain. "You wanted to destroy the painting," one of the shadows hissed, its voice thin and razor-sharp. "But you cannot destroy us. We were born here. We are the essence of this world." Nathaniel tried to scream again, but no sound left his mouth. The horror of it all was choking him, pressing in on him from every angle. He could feel the weight of the souls in his chest, their collective grief and fury pressing against the walls of his mind, threatening to break him apart. He felt their gnawing hunger, They were hungry for freedom, hungry for vengeance, hungry for life. We are you now. 1,000 voices whispered as one, the sound ringing in his skull. We live through you. We are part of you. His body trembled with an agony he had never known, his veins throbbing with an unnatural pulse. The darkness inside him began to move, crawling beneath his skin like insects, writhing with life. He could feel the curse growing stronger within him, spreading from his chest to his limbs, to his head, consuming him from the inside out. The woman, the one who had trapped them all, appeared before him again, her form rising from the black abyss. This time, she was no longer just a face, no longer just a figure painted on canvas. She was here, in the flesh, her twisted smile growing wider, her eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. "You thought you could sacrifice yourself," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "But you gave yourself to me, Nathaniel. You gave yourself to all of us. You're not free. You will never be free." He tried to move away from her, but his limbs refused to obey. The shadows inside him, the souls, they had control now. He was no longer Nathaniel. He was the vessel, the cage. The painting had taken him, consumed him, and in return, he was now a part of it, a part of the curse. His mind screamed in defiance, but it was drowned out by the cacophony of voices inside his skull. The woman reached out, her fingers trailing across his face. It felt cold, colder than anything he had ever experienced. She caressed him like a puppet, guiding his movements, molding him into something that was no longer human. The others wanted to break free, she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "But you become the key, Nathaniel. The painting needs you now. It needs you to bring more in, to feed it, to keep it alive." As the words sank in, Nathaniel's stomach twisted, his heart sinking into the pit of his chest. He understood now. The painting was not just a trap for the souls. It was a living entity, a force that needed to be fed, sustained. It had fed on Gregory, on countless others before him, and now it was feeding on him. The woman purred, her voice sweet as poison. "And it will never let you go." Nathaniel could feel it. The pull, the draw. The painting was calling to him, urging him to bring others into the cursed world, to fill the void within it. He could hear their voices, the other souls, whispering in his mind, desperate for him to act, to feed the curse so that it might grow, so that it could swallow everything. He was losing himself. There was no way out. "I can't. I won't," Nathaniel whispered, the words barely leaving his lips as he fought the urge to give in. The shadowed souls inside him grew frantic, their whispers louder, urging him to yield, to feed the painting more victims, to keep the curse alive. The weight of their presence was unbearable. The woman smiled at him, her eyes gleaming with a terrible hunger. She knew he could feel it, the hunger. "You cannot fight it," she said softly, almost lovingly. "You've already given in. Your soul is mine now. And when you bring others to us, we will grow stronger until this world, your world, is swallowed whole by the painting." Nathaniel's breath grew shallow as he realized the truth. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was the conduit, the way in which the curse would spread, the way the painting would feed. And as long as he existed in this cursed world, the shadows would grow, the painting would continue to expand, consuming more souls, feeding on them until there was nothing left. "Please." His voice cracked as he spoke, but the woman's laugh was the only answer, a sound that echoed in his mind and stretched out into infinity. "It's too late for you, Nathaniel. You are ours. You are always ours. Now and forever." Nathaniel felt the darkness begin to consume him, his body collapsing in on itself as the shadows inside him fused with the painting's will. His screams were swallowed by the void. And then, as the painting's power surged through him, a thought flickered in his mind. Had it been worth it? But there was no answer. Only the endless whispers, only the cold embrace of the darkness. as the painting continued to feed. Nathaniel's form, once human, began to fade, his very existence being consumed by the painting's insidious power. The shadows that had taken root inside him pulsed, thrumming like a heartbeat, growing stronger with each passing second. The woman's figure swirled around him, her cold fingers tracing invisible lines across his skin, leaving marks that burned with an icy intensity. The world around him began to warp, as if he were no longer a part of reality. The edges of his vision blurred, and the very air seemed to thicken, coalescing into something otherworldly. The faces of the lost souls, those trapped within the painting before him, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed upon him, their bodies twisted and writhing in agony. They reached out, their hands clawing at the air, desperate to touch him, to pull him further into the void. "Join us, Nathaniel," they whispered in unison, their voices soft and insistent. "You are one of us now, forever." He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost in the overwhelming sea of whispers, his throat dry, as if the very act of speaking had been stolen from him. His limbs trembled, his skin crawling with the sensation of being watched, surrounded by 1,000 faceless souls that were no longer separate entities, but one with him, each whispering their torment into his mind. "This is your prison now." The woman's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and cutting. "This is your new reality. The painting is alive, and you are its heart." Nathaniel's mind screamed for escape, but his body was no longer his own. The curse had twisted him beyond recognition. His sense of self was slipping away, dissolving into the endless darkness around him. The hunger inside him was growing, unbearable, like a gnawing emptiness that demanded to be fed. "You will bring us more," the woman's voice cooed, her tone sweet and dark, like honey laced with venom. "You will feed the painting, Nathaniel. You will bring us more souls to devour. You will feel it, we will feel it, and the painting will grow." As the woman spoke, Nathaniel's vision began to flicker. The darkness around him began to pulse and shift, the edges of the void bending and folding in on themselves like the crumpling of paper. For a fleeting moment, he caught a glimpse of something, a faint outline of a figure, someone alive. A shadow in the distance, standing alone, unaware of the horrors around them. A new soul. The painting had sensed it too. "Bring them to us," the woman hissed, her voice a command now, her eyes glowing with a sickening hunger. "You are the conduit. You will find them. You will make them ours." The image of the figure in the distance became clearer, just a silhouette at first, but as Nathaniel's mind locked onto it, he saw it more distinctly. A young woman, walking alone, through a forest, her steps slow and deliberate, her face turned down, unaware of the fate that was about to find her. Nathaniel's chest tightened as the force of the painting's influence took hold of him, pulling him toward the woman in the forest. His body moved against his will, the darkness within him propelling him forward, his fingers twitching as though reaching for her. The souls inside him urged him on, their voices rising in a desperate, hungry chorus. Bring her to us. He wanted to resist. He wanted to fight it to save her. But he could feel the painting's will stronger than his own, filling him, guiding his every move. His body, his soul, they were no longer his own. The painting was his master now. As he moved, the world around him shifted. The edges of reality seemed to blur. He was no longer in the void, no longer in the cursed painting. Instead, he was in the world he had once known, the familiar landscape of the forest, with the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of birds. But there was something wrong, something unnatural about it. The air felt thick, charged with an energy he couldn't understand. The young woman continued walking, her steps unhurried, completely unaware of the impending danger. Nathaniel's heart raced in his chest, his hands trembling as he reached out. He was so close now, just steps away from her. And then, as if in response to his proximity, the air shifted. The shadows around him seemed to grow thicker, swirling at his feet, creeping up his legs like living tendrils. They reached for her, pulling the very light from the forest, until the air became suffocatingly still. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat as the woman paused, her head tilting upward as if she sensed something wrong. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking as the darkness surged forward, surrounding her. "Don't, run." But it was too late. The shadows closed in on her, their claws reaching for her, dragging her into the encroaching dark. The woman screamed, but it was a sound swallowed by the oppressive void, her cries quickly drowned by the darkness. Nathaniel could feel it then, the souls inside him, their voices rising in a chorus of triumph. The painting had found its next victim. It would feed again. "She's ours now." The woman's voice echoed in his mind, sweet and triumphant. "You did well, Nathaniel. You brought her to us." The woman in the forest disappeared into the shadows, her form consumed by the curse. Nathaniel's body trembled, his hands shaking as he stood, powerless, watching her vanish. The feeling of emptiness inside him deepened, but so did the sense of satisfaction. The curse had been fed. The painting had grown, but deep inside, buried beneath the overwhelming presence of the souls and the painting's influence, Nathaniel could still feel a faint flicker of resistance. He wasn't fully gone yet. Not yet, but time was running out. The painting was hungry, and it would never stop. It would never let him go. Nathaniel stood frozen in the forest, the shadows of the cursed painting swirling around him, feeding on the woman's scream. Her presence was still lingering in the air, her soul consumed by the painting's endless hunger. But the satisfaction of fulfilling the curse's demand was short-lived, a hollow feeling spreading through him. He could feel the painting's insatiable hunger gnawing at his soul, the gnawing ache that now consumed him, threatening to suffocate any remaining shred of his humanity. It was a hunger he could never satiate, and it would never stop. The whispers in his mind had grown louder, more insistent, their voices melding into one collective murmur that rattled his very being. More, more. Every moment spent in this twisted existence felt like a lifetime, each second bringing him closer to becoming just another part of the painting, just another soul feeding its insatiable need. Yet somewhere deep within him, Nathaniel still clung to the last vestiges of his humanity, the faintest flicker of resistance buried beneath the weight of the curse. "We are you," the woman's voice echoed, smooth and triumphant. "You are a part of us now, Nathaniel. You will never escape." His hands trembled at his sides, and his breath quickened as the world around him began to warp once more. The forest around him blurred, shifting as though it was a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. The shadows grew thicker, swirling in the corners of his vision, beckoning him toward them, urging him to bring more, to feed the painting with the lives of others. But Nathaniel felt something new this time, a surge of strength. It was weak, barely there, but it was a spark, a flicker of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. "You will bring us more," the voices inside him said, louder now, a chorus of demands. "It's your purpose. It's your destiny, to feed us, to bring us the souls." Nathaniel clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands. The hunger inside him was unbearable, a twisting knot in his stomach. But as he focused, he could feel that flicker again, his will, his choice. The painting had consumed him, yes, but it hadn't fully destroyed him. Not yet. His mind flashed to the moment when he had first seen the cursed painting, to the first time it had taken root in his life, to the first death, to the countless others that had followed. He remembered the faces of those he had lost, their desperate cries still haunting him. Each victim, each soul, had been consumed and absorbed by the painting, but Nathaniel had been the conduit. He had been the one who brought them in. But no more. No more, he whispered to himself, his voice weak but resolute. "I won't feed you. I won't give you more." The shadows in his mind recoiled like a thing struck, and for a moment, there was silence, a painful, aching silence. The darkness pulsed around him, but Nathaniel fought to hold on to the small shred of his will, refusing to let it go, refusing to give in. "You can't resist," the woman's voice crooned, now cold and venomous. "You're ours, Nathaniel. You belong to the painting. There's no escaping it. There's no escaping us." The shadows stretched, reaching for him, pulling at his limbs, tightening their grip on his body. He could feel them trying to drag him back into the depths of the painting, to reassert their control over him. The weight of it all, the cursed power, the souls, the endless hunger, was almost too much to bear. But Nathaniel wouldn't break. Not yet. He closed his eyes and concentrated, focusing on the flicker of defiance that had ignited within him. It was a fragile thing, like a candle flickering in a storm, but it was enough. The more he focused on it, the brighter it became. He could feel the pull of the painting, the darkness closing in around him, but he refused to be swallowed by it. He had to break free. He had to find a way. Suddenly, a flash of light broke through the darkness, a blinding, searing flash that illuminated the entire forest, casting away the shadows, banishing the oppressive weight of the curse. Nathaniel gasped, the light feeling like a lifeline, like the first breath of fresh air in an eternity. He opened his eyes, blinking against the brightness. The forest around him had vanished, replaced by an empty, void-like landscape, endless and barren. He was no longer in the world he had known. He was no longer even in the painting. He was somewhere in between, a place that existed outside of time and space, outside of reality itself. And standing before him, her figure now solid and real, was the woman, the one who had cursed him, the one who had manipulated him into feeding the painting's insatiable hunger. "You think you can escape me?" she said, her voice now dripping with malice. "You think you can resist the pull of the painting? It is your essence now. It is who you are. You belong to it, Nathaniel. You belong to me." Nathaniel stood tall, his body shaking, his heart pounding, but he didn't look away from her. He could feel the painting's influence still pressing against his mind, like a weight, like a presence that was always just on the edge of his consciousness. The hunger was still there, gnawing at him, urging him to feed it, to bring more souls into the cursed web. But in that moment, Nathaniel realized something profound. He could still choose. He could still fight. With everything he had left, he reached deep inside himself, pulling on that last spark of resistance, that final thread of defiance, and he screamed with all his might, his voice raw and desperate. "No!" The woman's smile faltered for a split second, her eyes narrowing as if sensing the shift within him. The ground beneath them began to tremble, the void shifting, cracking like glass, splintering into fractures. "You cannot fight this forever," she hissed, her form beginning to distort, as though the power of the painting was pulling at her too, threatening to unravel her. But Nathaniel wasn't listening. He was too focused on the last flicker of hope. The bond between him and the painting, the one that had controlled him, was beginning to crack, the curse unraveling like a thread slowly being pulled apart. "I won't be your puppet anymore," he muttered through gritted teeth, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "I refuse." With that, the light intensified, bright and overwhelming, until it consumed everything, shattering the dark landscape, tearing apart the fabric of the curse. For a moment, there was nothing but light, pure, blinding light. And then silence. Nathaniel woke, gasping for breath, his chest heaving. He was lying on the floor of his apartment, the painting on the wall before him, silent, still, and unmoving. The room was dark, the chill of night creeping in through the window. He was free, at least for now. The painting, once a gateway to the cursed world, had fallen silent. The woman's presence, the souls, the hunger, everything seemed to have vanished. But Nathaniel knew this wasn't over. The curse had been broken, for now, but something lingered in the back of his mind, a sense that the painting wasn't finished. It would find another way, another victim to feed on. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Nathaniel had a choice. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't a puppet. He had broken the cycle. And that, at least, was enough for now. Nathaniel lay there on the floor, his breath still ragged, his heart pounding in his chest, as if trying to break free from the grip of his own fear. The room around him was quiet, eerily still, but the silence felt different now, unnatural. It was as though the very air had thickened, the weight of the curse still hanging in the corners of the room like an unspoken threat. The painting, his eyes flickered toward the canvas that had once been his prison and now felt like a warning. It hung on the wall, its surface reflecting the dim light of the room, the twisted image of the woman still visible, her eyes cold and lifeless. But it was different. The eyes, once an oppressive gaze, no longer seemed to watch him. They were empty. The woman's figure was still there, but it was quieter now, more like a faint echo of the nightmare she had been. Nathaniel's hands trembled as he pushed himself into a sitting position, his body aching as though he had fought for his very life. He stared at the painting, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to destroy it, burn it, tear it down piece by piece, but another part, a darker, more desperate part, felt a strange pull. The painting was silent now. Yes, but was it over? Had it really ended? His eyes narrowed, studying the image. Was there something in the woman's posture, the faintest shift in the curve of her hand? A shimmer in the light that didn't quite belong? It was as if something was hiding beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. A shiver ran down his spine. The urge to tear it down was overwhelming, but Nathaniel fought it, his hands balling into fists. He had already fought this curse once, defeated it, and in the process, he had severed his connection to it. He had to believe that it was over, that he was free. But what if the painting was waiting for him to let his guard down? He pushed the thought from his mind, standing up slowly. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. He wasn't going to be controlled by the whispers, by the shadows that had consumed him. He had taken control of his life back, and he wasn't going to let fear undo that. Forcing himself to move, he turned away from the painting, crossing the room to the kitchen. He needed something to ground him, something real. His hand shook as he grabbed a glass from the cupboard, filling it with water and gulping it down in one long swallow. His reflection in the dark window opposite him looked strained and hollow, his eyes wide with exhaustion and lingering terror. As the water slid down his throat, he felt something shift in his chest, a flicker of relief. He wasn't entirely free, but he was alive. He had made it through. He had survived. For now. The thought lingered, a quiet whisper at the back of his mind. He couldn't let his guard down. He couldn't let the curse trick him again. It had been in him, controlling him, pulling him into its web for so long. It was no longer just a painting. It was a part of him now, a part of his past, and perhaps a part of his future. He would need to be vigilant. But just as he took a breath to steady himself, a cold gust of wind swept through the room. It was sharp, biting, and carried with it an unmistakable presence, like the brush of a hand against his skin, faint but unmistakable. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. His eyes shot toward the window, his pulse racing. There was no open window. The door was locked. There was no draft, but the cold. It was real, and it was creeping across the room, like a shadow, like an invitation. The air grew thick with it, and Nathaniel could almost taste the fear beginning to claw at the edges of his mind. He turned around, heart hammering, but it was too late. The painting had changed. The woman's eyes were no longer empty. They were looking at him, staring. Her hand, once limp, had shifted, her fingers curling as if they were reaching out to him. And as Nathaniel watched in horror, the colors of the painting began to shift. warping slowly at first, but with a sinister momentum. The brushstrokes were alive, as if the painting itself were breathing. The woman's mouth, once closed in a silent scream, began to open, just a crack at first, but it was enough to send chills down his spine. The room, once still, began to feel smaller. The walls seemed to close in around him, the space becoming suffocating. He stumbled backward, his hands bracing against the kitchen counter, his eyes wide with growing panic. No, he muttered, stepping backward, his mind screaming for a way out. This can't be happening. The whispers returned, faint at first, like distant murmurs. Then louder, closer. Unseen voices, hollow and desperate, clawing at the edges of his sanity. You thought you could escape. The painting's colors shifted more violently now, swirling like a storm, as though someone, was fighting to escape. Nathaniel's breath hitched as he saw her face, her true face, emerging from the canvas, the woman's eyes glowing with an unnatural light, her expression twisted in a grotesque parody of smile. Her fingers moved, twitching as if they were trying to crawl out from the painting itself. "You belong to us," the woman whispered, her voice now low and dripping with venom. "You were never free, Nathaniel. We always return. You can never escape us." The shadows in the room surged forward, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The temperature dropped even further, an icy chill that settled deep in Nathaniel's bones. He was no longer alone in the room. He could feel them, the souls, the cursed entities trapped within the painting, now feeding on his fear, feeding on his terror. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But the weight of the curse, the grip of the painting, was too strong now. I will not. He whispered to himself, trying to hold onto his defiance. But the whispers grew louder, the pressure unbearable. He could feel it all. The painting, the darkness, the souls, closing in on him, suffocating him. Every breath he took felt like it was being stolen from him. Suddenly, the lights flickered. And in that moment, Nathaniel realized with a sickening clarity that the curse, the painting, it wasn't just after him. It was after everything. The darkness, the hunger, it would never stop. It would never let him go. The room seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, like the very walls were breathing. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, a cacophony of souls screaming in the dark. Each breath Nathaniel took felt heavier, suffocating him under the weight of the curse. His heart raced, each beat echoing like thunder, shaking his very bones. The painting on the wall, it had come alive. The woman's face was no longer static, frozen in time as it had once been. Her eyes gleamed with a sickening light, swirling with malice, and her mouth twisted into a mocking grin, the edges stretching unnaturally wide. Nathaniel's stomach churned at the sight, his legs refusing to move as if the air itself had thickened around him, trapping him in place. "We've come for you," the woman's voice whispered from the painting, her voice low and seductive, yet dripping with an ancient hatred. "We were always going to come for you, Nathaniel." There was never any escape. The shadows in the room deepened, shifting like living creatures, stretching across the walls. They slithered towards him, caressing his skin with an unnatural cold. He could feel their tendrils, each one tightening around him, seeping into his veins, draining the warmth from his body. "You are ours." The woman's voice coiled around him, her presence suffocating. "You're part of the painting now. You belong to us." Nathaniel's thoughts spun in a haze of terror. He had fought so hard. He had tried to sever the bond, to break free, but it was like trying to tear apart his own soul. The painting had never let go of him. The darkness, the curse, it had always been waiting for the moment when he would finally lower his guard. The whispers grew louder, desperate, hungry. The souls trapped within the painting clawed at his mind, demanding more, urging him to feed them. More souls, they chorused. More to devour. He could feel the pressure building, his chest tightening with each breath, his heart hammering faster. His body was no longer his own. It was as though he were merely a vessel, a puppet to the forces that had long since taken control. But deep within him, buried beneath the terror and the hunger, there was a small flicker, a spark of defiance. It was weak, fragile, but it was there. The painting had consumed so much of him, but it hadn't taken everything. Not yet. No, Nathaniel whispered, his voice raw, his throat burning as if every word was an act of resistance. I won't let you win. The woman's grin widened, her face distorted with an unnatural glee. You already have, Nathaniel. You already belong to us. But Nathaniel wasn't finished. He still had one last thing, one last choice. His hand shot out, trembling with exertion, and grabbed the nearest object he could find, a knife, sharp and cold, lying on the counter from the last time he had used it. His fingers wrapped around the hilt, and despite the tremor running through his body, he forced himself to lift it. You can't escape, the woman taunted, her voice seeping into his mind. You'll feed us. You'll bring us more. You'll be ours forever. His breath hitched as he felt the painting's power intensifying, pressing in on him from all sides. The shadows constricted around him like chains, pulling at his limbs, the cold creeping into his bones. But he fought. He fought with every ounce of strength left in him. Nathaniel's grip tightened on the knife. His hand trembled, but his will was steady. With a cry of defiance, he drove the blade into the canvas. The force of it sent a shock wave through the room. At first, there was silence. Then, the painting began to scream, a terrible, horrible sound, unlike anything Nathaniel had ever heard. The air rippled, the walls around him bending as though reality itself was cracking under the pressure of his strike. The room seemed to buckle in on itself, warping, bending, as though the curse was trying to hold on, trying to keep him from breaking free. But Nathaniel wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't just fighting for his own life. He was fighting for every soul the painting had consumed, for every victim trapped inside it. He had to destroy it, once and for all. The blade slid deeper into the canvas, as though the painting itself were alive, struggling to defend itself. The woman's face distorted further, her eyes widening with rage, her mouth contorting into a scream that echoed in the very walls of the apartment. You can't destroy us, she screamed, her voice distorted, jagged. We are eternal. We are part of the darkness. You can't break the cycle. But Nathaniel's resolve didn't falter. His heart was pounding, his body shaking from the effort, but the knife continued to sink into the cursed canvas. Each inch he pushed it forward felt like a battle against a force that had been centuries in the making. But the light in his chest, the last flicker of his humanity, burned brighter with each second. And then, with a final, desperate shove, the blade tore through the painting, cutting through it like paper. For a moment, everything went still. The room was silent. The shadows were gone. The whispers had stopped. The oppressive weight that had pressed on his chest was lifted. Nathaniel stood, panting, his legs weak beneath him. The painting hung in front of him, torn, the woman's image now reduced to nothing more than a broken smear of color and distortion. The air was heavy, but there was no more hunger. No more shadows. It was over. But as he stared at the mangled remnants of the cursed painting, a deep, unsettling silence filled the room. His breath slowed, his heartbeat returning to normal, but the sense of finality that he had hoped for felt distant, like a shadow in the corner of his mind. He wasn't sure if he was truly free, and that thought gnawed at him as he slowly turned away from the painting, his mind heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Was this the end? Had the curse truly been broken, or had it only just begun to shift into something new? Something darker? Nathaniel didn't have the answers, but as he stepped away, the painting behind him, torn and broken, seemed to watch him. And somewhere deep in his soul, he could feel it. The curse was not gone. It was waiting for him to slip, waiting for him to forget. It was never over. Not really. The game was still on. As Nathaniel left the room, his thoughts were clouded with doubt, and the feeling of not being done hung over him like an unshakable fog. He had defeated the painting, hadn't he? It was destroyed, ripped apart, the woman's cursed face now a twisted, shredded mess. But there was something deeper gnawing at him, something that felt wrong. The darkness had lifted from the room, yes. The cold that had enveloped him was gone. But the weight, the heavy, unsettling weight of something watching had not. He paced nervously around his apartment, trying to shake the feeling. But no matter how fast he moved, no matter how many times he told himself it was over, his mind wouldn't let go. The silence was oppressive, and as the seconds passed, he became more and more aware of the subtle tremor in his hands, the tension that coiled tight in his chest. It's just fear, he thought, trying to convince himself. The painting was part of me, part of my past. It's gone now. It's over. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of something. A shadow, not the kind that should be there. His breath caught in his throat. It moved quickly, like a flicker in his peripheral vision, vanishing the moment he turned his head toward it. A cold chill swept through the apartment again, colder than before. This time, there was no draft, no broken window, no logical explanation. The painting, his heart raced, and the urge to turn back, to check if it was still hanging on the wall, nearly overwhelmed him. But he didn't have to look. He could feel it, the drawing, the oppressive presence. The painting had been broken, yes, but he could still sense the echo of its power. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, he told himself, rubbing his eyes. He tried to push the fear aside, but it refused to be silenced. The silence in the apartment now felt like an omen. He moved to the wall where the painting had once hung, feeling an irrational compulsion to see what had become of it. What he found made his blood run cold. The wall was bare, no remnants of the canvas, no shreds of the cursed portrait. But then, in the dim light of the room, something caught his eye. A faint smear, dark and jagged, across the surface of the wall. At first, Nathaniel thought it was just a mark of dust or grime, but as he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was unmistakable, the shape, the faint outline of a face, and it was moving. His pulse thundered in his ears as he reached out a trembling hand to touch it. His fingers brushed the mark, and it felt alive. The coldness from the painting's remnants clung to his fingertips, and for a moment, he thought he saw something flicker beneath the surface of the wall, a hint of eyes, an expression. The woman, the cursed woman. Her image was not gone. It had simply moved. Nathaniel stumbled back, his mind racing. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt as though it were being crushed by 1,000 hands, squeezing, tightening. The shadows in the room seemed to crawl closer, their edges sharp and jagged, like claws scraping across the floor. He realized with a sickening clarity, the painting was just the beginning. In the corner of the room, he thought he saw movement, a faint flicker of the same woman's figure, her shadow passed along the wall. Her silhouette grew clearer, more defined, until her figure materialized from the darkness. She stood there tall, her long, twisted fingers stretching toward him, her eyes glowing faintly from within the dark. Nathaniel's breath hitched. It was her, but she was not the same. This was not the painting anymore. She was free. Her mouth parted into a twisted, mocking smile, and she whispered his name. Nathaniel. The voice was a low rasp, like broken glass scraping against metal. But there was an unmistakable coldness in it, a hunger, a terrible, insatiable hunger. Her fingers twitched. The room grew darker, and Nathaniel felt the ground beneath his feet tremble. The walls seemed to move, closing in on him. The shadows wrapped tighter around him, a vice that refused to let go. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, paralyzed by terror. "You can never escape," she whispered again, her voice now a low growl, a forceful command. You thought you could break the cycle, but the cycle is you. You are part of it, Nathaniel. You are ours. The shadows in the room surged forward, tendrils reaching for him, cold fingers grasping at his limbs, pulling him into the dark. He struggled, fought, but it was useless. The fear was overwhelming. There was nowhere to go. The woman's form loomed closer, her smile widening, her eyes now filled with rage. You're ours now, she repeated, her voice thick with malice. Your soul was the last piece. And now we have you forever. Nathaniel's vision blurred, his body weakening, the shadows clawing at his skin. He felt himself being pulled toward the woman, no longer a painting, but something more, something darker. But in the midst of the terror, something sparked within him, something he had buried deep, a memory, a realization. He had destroyed the painting. He had broken the curse, or so he thought. But the painting had never been the only thing that needed to be destroyed. It was a symptom of something far older, far darker. The woman was not just a curse. She was a manifestation, a creature born of the darkness that had been consuming souls for centuries. Nathaniel fought against the pull, his mind racing, the flickers of hope growing in intensity. His legs gave out beneath him, but he refused to surrender. He couldn't let this creature win. Not again. With every ounce of strength left in him, Nathaniel pushed himself to his feet. He had faced death before. He had faced fear. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. You think you can fight it? The woman's laugh rang out in the dark, cruel and mocking. You think you can stop me? You've already given me what I need. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. The shadows closed in, and the walls continued to twist, but in the chaos, one thing became clear. There was still a way out. The key was not in fighting the curse itself. It was in accepting it. For the curse would only ever hold as long as it could convince him he was powerless. And that was where he would win. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest as the shadows continued to close in, their tendrils tightening, gripping him, pulling him toward the woman, who was now more like a specter of rage and hunger. Her twisted smile stretched wider, and her voice echoed, a cacophony of mocking whispers that filled the room, drowned out all his thoughts. You can't fight me, she taunted, the echo of her words sinking into him like poison. You're already mine. You always were. But in that moment, something shifted in Nathaniel. Amid the terror, amid the weight of the curse bearing down on him, something deep within him clicked, a realization. The woman, the painting, this was never about a piece of art. It wasn't about the canvas or the brushstrokes. It was about him, about his fear, his guilt, his deepest doubts. The curse had only survived because he had believed in it. He had let it consume him. He had given it power. But now he understood. The only way to destroy it wasn't through force or resistance. It wasn't through fighting. It was through acceptance. The darkness had come from his own mind, from the fear that had taken root in him the moment he had first laid eyes on the cursed painting. He had let that fear grow, let it feed on him, let it define him. He had tried to break free, but in doing so, he had only prolonged the cycle. To break the curse, he had to let go of that fear, to confront it, to embrace it, not as an enemy, but as part of himself. To stop running, to stop fighting. With a deep, steadying breath, Nathaniel closed his eyes. The room felt colder still, the shadows pressing against him like an invisible weight. But instead of resisting, instead of panicking, he embraced it. He opened himself to the fear, the darkness, the woman. He allowed the cold tendrils of the curse to wash over him, to twist around him, until they were no longer separate from him, but part of him. I see you, Nathaniel whispered, his voice breaking through the silence of his thoughts. You are part of me, and I am not afraid of you anymore. The woman's form shifted, her face contorting in confusion, the smile faltering. She recoiled, the darkness rippling around her like water disturbed by a stone. No, she screamed. You can't do this. You can't just accept us." But Nathaniel was resolute. He wasn't just accepting the curse, he was owning it. He was no longer its prisoner. He was its master. And then, as if the room itself were reacting to his defiance, the shadows around him began to recede. Slowly at first, as if unsure of whether to obey him. But the longer he stood there, the more they faded away, like smoke dissipating in the air. The woman's face twisted into a mask of fury, her form disintegrating into swirling tendrils of blackness. "You can't escape this," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "You're nothing without the curse." But Nathaniel knew better now. He wasn't nothing. The curse had tried to consume him, to make him believe it was his only identity. But now he understood it was never the curse that defined him. It was his choice, his will. The more he embraced his own darkness, the more the shadows faltered. The room began to shift again, the oppressive weight of the curse lifting, crumbling away like ash. He felt the painting's energy draining, its power withering beneath his resolve. The woman's screams grew fainter, distorted by the strength of his mind, his belief in his own power. His heart, once heavy with fear, now swelled with a sense of freedom, an understanding that the curse had always been nothing more than a reflection of his inner turmoil. His fear had fed it, but now his acceptance was destroying it. The walls began to return to their normal size, the air warming as if the curse were being purged from the room. The shadows recoiled, like creatures retreating from the light. The woman's form shattered completely, dissolving into nothingness, leaving only the faintest trace of her existence in the air. Nathaniel's chest rose and fell, steadying as the last of the darkness faded away. He was free, not because he had fought against the curse, but because he had stopped fighting it. And just as the room seemed to return to normal, he could feel something new within him. A power, a peace. The curse had been a part of his journey, not an enemy, but a teacher. It had shown him the depths of his own fears, his own limits. And now it was gone. His soul was no longer bound to it. He was free to move forward, truly free. And as he stood there, breathing in the warm, clear air of the room, Nathaniel realized with a shiver of relief that the painting, its curse, was truly gone. For good. The shadows that had once ruled him, that had once threatened to consume him, had been transformed. No longer a source of fear, but a symbol of his strength. The cycle had ended. He was no longer Nathaniel the prisoner. He was Nathaniel, the master of his own fate. And with that, he turned away from the broken remnants of the painting, stepping out into the light, ready to leave the darkness behind. Nathaniel stepped cautiously into the light of the hallway outside his apartment, the weight of the curse finally lifting from his shoulders. His heart, which had once thundered in fear, now beat steadily, each pulse a reminder of his victory. But as he walked down the hallway, his mind felt restless, the peace still fragile, the lessons learned not entirely settled. The apartment behind him, once a prison, now felt like a distant memory. It was no longer a place of torment, but a chapter in his past. But what lay ahead? Would he truly be able to leave all of it behind? He paused in the elevator lobby, staring at the blinking floor numbers above. The world felt normal again, too normal. A strange, empty sensation filled him, like something important had slipped away, something beyond the curse. He pressed the elevator button, but his hand lingered for a moment, hovering over it. Something tugged at him, something he couldn't quite place. He had faced his demons, conquered them, but a part of him, one small, nagging part, wondered if the darkness could truly be left behind. I should leave. I should walk away, start fresh, he thought. But there's a feeling, something I can't ignore. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Nathaniel stepped inside. He pressed the button for the ground floor. The sound of the door closing behind him was oddly final, like the world outside was waiting, ready to embrace him or swallow him whole. As the elevator descended, He glanced at his reflection in the mirrored walls. His eyes were tired, but something was different. There was a stillness in his gaze. He could see the shadows of his past, but they no longer owned him. The doors opened with a soft ding, and Nathaniel stepped out into the quiet, empty lobby of the building. The air was crisp, and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filled the silence. As he reached for the front door, the feeling, the nagging unease, rose again, stronger this time. It was like a presence, a pull, a whisper. His fingers brushed the door handle, but before he could open it, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He turned sharply, his gaze snapping toward the rear of the lobby. A figure stood at the end of the hall, half in shadow. It was a man, dressed in a dark coat, the collar turned up, his face obscured in the low light. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. There was something about him, something familiar, something wrong. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. But Nathaniel could feel his presence like a weight, like a shadow that had never truly left him. His first instinct was to ignore it, to walk away, to leave the building and the nightmares behind. But something compelled him to approach. As he stepped forward, the figure shifted slightly, revealing a face that seemed distorted. Not quite human, but not entirely unfamiliar either. The man's eyes gleamed with a cold, unnatural light, the same eerie glow that had once belonged to the woman in the painting. Nathaniel froze. His breath hitched in his chest. "You didn't think it was over, did you?" The figure's voice echoed in the stillness of the lobby. It was low, smooth, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakably clear. It was not the woman's voice, but something equally chilling. Nathaniel's body tensed, and a surge of dread rushed through him, as though his mind was refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. He had broken the curse, hadn't he? This couldn't be happening. "It's never truly over," the figure continued, his voice dripping with an icy, malicious calm. "You were right to fear what you didn't understand. The darkness is not something you fight, Nathaniel. It's something you inherit." Nathaniel's pulse thundered in his ears, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. He stepped back slowly, his mind spinning, heart racing. His chest tightened with the suffocating pressure of the figure's words. What was this? What was happening? "I know you think you've escaped," the figure continued, the darkness seeming to cling to him like a cloak. "But you're wrong. The curse you destroyed was only a fragment of something far older, far more powerful. Something that cannot be severed so easily." A chill ran down Nathaniel's spine. The words cut through him like a blade. His breath quickened as the figure began to approach, slow and deliberate, each step reverberating through the still air. "You may have broken the painting," the figure said, stopping just a few feet away. "But you've already given us what we need. The curse lives within you now. You are the vessel, Nathaniel. The next chapter has just begun." Nathaniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he backed away. He felt the walls of the lobby pressing in on him, the dark figure before him growing ever closer, its presence suffocating. He had been free. He had fought so hard to be free. But now, standing in front of him, this figure seemed to embody everything he had feared. "You could try to run again," the figure said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But you'll always carry it with you. The curse doesn't let go. It's in your blood, in your soul, and it will find you." Nathaniel's mind was racing. He had faced the curse, had fought the darkness within the painting, and now, in this moment, the truth struck him. The curse had never been just about the woman or the painting. It had always been about him. It was a part of him embedded deep within his psyche, a part of his past, a part of his fear, and that part could never be completely erased. He took a shaky breath, his legs almost giving way beneath him. The figure's words echoed in his mind, but deep down, he knew that he couldn't let this consume him again. He couldn't let himself be chained to the darkness forever. "No," Nathaniel whispered, his voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. "I won't be your vessel. I won't let you take me again." The figure's smile faltered just for a moment, as though taken aback. Then, a dark laugh rippled from his throat, like the sound of a storm gathering strength. "You already are," the figure said softly, his eyes gleaming with that same malevolent light. "And there's nowhere you can hide from that truth." Nathaniel knew that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The curse would follow him, as it always had. But for the first time, he wasn't running. He was standing his ground. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. The figure took a step forward, and Nathaniel steeled himself for what was to come. The air in the lobby thickened with an oppressive sense of dread as Nathaniel locked eyes with the figure. The figure's eyes, those unnaturally gleaming orbs, held him captive, pulling at the very core of his being. He could feel the coldness wrapping around him again, seeping into his bones, the curse whispering at the edges of his consciousness. But Nathaniel stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. The figure's words gnawed at him, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. Not again. He took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch between them, the weight of the figure's presence suffocating him. It was an act of will, a defiance, and it was all he had left. "You don't control me," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "You never have." The figure tilted his head, almost as if amused by Nathaniel's resistance. His smile twisted into something more sinister. "You still don't understand, do you?" The figure stepped forward, his movements smooth and unnerving, as though he were gliding through the air. "You can't escape what's within you. It's not a matter of control. You are the curse, Nathaniel. The darkness is your birthright, and it will always find you. It's in your blood, in your soul. You're already part of it, whether you accept it or not." Nathaniel's chest tightened, a flicker of doubt briefly stirring within him. Was he truly trapped in this cycle? Had the curse somehow found its way into his very being, embedded deeper than he realized? But no, he wouldn't let himself fall into that spiral of despair again. He had faced the darkness once, and now he would do it again on his own terms. "You are wrong," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the figure's words like a blade. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, and I'm not afraid of what's inside me. I will not let you control me." The figure paused, a flash of something almost like confusion flickering across his face. He was still. The air seemed to hold its breath. "What's inside you?" The figure's voice dropped to a low, mocking whisper. "You think you can defeat me by pretending you're free of me? You think you can defeat your own nature?" He stepped even closer, his eyes now inches from Nathaniel's face. "I am your nature, Nathaniel. You'll never be rid of me. We are one and the same." Nathaniel's pulse raced, but this time there was a different kind of clarity. He had lived his life in fear of the curse, in fear of the darkness that lurked within him. But he had been wrong to fight it. He had been wrong to try to sever himself from it. The darkness didn't define him. It was a part of him just as much as the light. He wasn't some helpless victim, some vessel for the curse. He was the master of his own fate. And if he could accept that, truly accept it, then he could control it. The figure's lips curled into a cruel smile, sensing Nathaniel's internal battle. "You still don't get it, do you?" The figure hissed. "The darkness isn't something you can tame. You'll always be mine." But Nathaniel took a step forward, his eyes now burning with determination. "No, you don't get it." His voice was stronger now, unshaken. "You think the darkness is something that controls me, but it doesn't. It's just a reflection of my fears. And I'm not afraid of it anymore." He reached inside himself, tapping into the strength he had discovered when he faced the curse the first time. The whispers of doubt, the flickering fears began to quiet. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't rejecting the darkness. He was embracing it, accepting it, and owning it. The figure, sensing the shift, began to retreat, but it was too late. The power Nathaniel had finally realized within himself surged forward, wrapping around him like a shield. The air of the lobby thickened once more, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was empowering. The figure faltered. "What are you doing?" The words were sharp with disbelief. "You're making a terrible mistake." Nathaniel's eyes locked with the figures, no longer filled with fear, but with clarity and purpose. "I'm not making a mistake. I'm taking control." Suddenly, the shadows that had once clung to Nathaniel now swirled around him, not as enemies, but as allies, extensions of his will. The darkness bent to his command. He could feel it pulsing through him, surging like an untamed river, but he held the reins. He was in control. The figure recoiled, his form flickering, the edges of his body rippling like smoke. "No," he hissed. "You cannot do this. You belong to me." Nathaniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply let the power within him grow, expanding, filling the space around him until the very air seemed to crackle with energy. The figure stumbled back, as if the force of Nathaniel's was a physical blow. The figure's face began to distort, the arrogance slipping away, replaced by the realization that he had underestimated Nathaniel all along. "You're mine," the figure snarled, his voice desperate, his form beginning to lose cohesion. Nathaniel stepped forward one final time, his hand raised. "No, I am mine." In that instant, the figure's form shattered like glass, disintegrating into the air, vanishing into nothingness. The curse, the darkness, the figure was gone. The lobby fell silent, the heavy weight of fear lifting entirely. Nathaniel stood alone in the center of the space, the air clear, still, and calm around him. He took a deep breath, letting the calm wash over him. The feeling of finality lingered, but so did a sense of relief. It was over. The curse had tried to claim him, tried to convince him that it was inescapable, but he had owned it. And in doing so, he had freed himself. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel understood. He wasn't a victim of his fears. He wasn't a prisoner of the curse. He was the master of his own darkness. And from this moment forward, he would carry it with him, not as a curse, but as a part of who he was. And that was his true freedom. The silence in the lobby felt like an eternity, but it was a welcome one. The oppressive weight of the curse had lifted, leaving Nathaniel with nothing but the echoes of the battle that had just occurred and the freedom that followed it. He stood there for a long moment, still catching his breath, the air around him clearer than he had ever known it to be. The shadows that had once clung to him, threatening to consume him, were gone, but not destroyed. They had been incorporated into him, understood, accepted as a part of his psyche rather than an enemy. A peace he'd never thought possible began to settle into his chest. But with that peace came the realization that his journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had conquered the darkness within himself, but now he had to face the world outside, the world that had been unaware of the battle he had waged in the confines of his apartment, and the sinister figure who had sought to claim him. As he walked out of the building, the cold evening air hit him like a wave, the city's lights twinkling around him like stars, bright and distant. It felt almost surreal, like he had stepped into a new reality. Everything seemed clearer, more vibrant, as though a fog had been lifted from his senses. He wasn't sure where to go, or what he was supposed to do now. There was no instruction manual for what had just happened. The curse that had haunted him was gone, but had he truly left it all behind? Was he still the same man? Or had he changed in ways that he couldn't yet fully comprehend? His mind spun with these questions as he walked aimlessly through the city streets. He passed through familiar places, the park, the bookstore, the quiet coffee shop he used to visit each. One feeling foreign, as though he was seeing it all for the first time. Everything was the same, yet nothing was. And in that strangeness, he felt both a strange sense of belonging and an overwhelming sense of isolation. Was this what it felt like to be free? Nathaniel stopped at a street corner, gazing up at the moonlit sky, his mind working furiously. I've broken the curse, he thought. But can anyone else understand? Will anyone else even see the difference? The thoughts swirled inside him, and then, as if to answer his unspoken question, he felt a sudden pressure in his chest. It wasn't a physical weight, more like an emotional tightness, an almost unbearable yearning. A part of him still hungered for something, for understanding, for connection, for others to know that he had fought the darkness, defeated it. But that hunger wasn't born of fear anymore. It was born of something deeper, something more personal. A need to share his truth, to show others what he had learned, to tell them that they too could master their own darkness if only they embraced it instead of running from it. He turned sharply, moving back toward the building, back toward his apartment, toward the place where all of this had started. But as he moved through the city streets, he couldn't help but feel the growing weight of something else pulling at him. A sensation, faint but persistent, tugging at the back of his mind. He quickened his pace, the unease building. There was something wrong. It wasn't the curse. It wasn't the darkness. This felt different. His heart began to race as he walked, and the sensation grew stronger. He was being watched. Nathaniel stopped in his tracks, his senses heightened, his eyes darting around the empty street. But there was no one. The street was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the trees. But he felt it, like a presence just out of reach, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. Not again, he thought, his stomach twisting. It can't be. Before he could finish the thought, a flash of movement caught his eye, a shadow darting across the alleyway just ahead. His pulse spiked. Nathaniel broke into a run, instinct driving him forward toward the alley. His breath quickened as he rounded the corner, his eyes scanning the dimly lit path. But there was nothing there. The alley was empty. He took another step, his heart pounding. And then, from the shadows, something moved. A figure emerged, tall and shrouded in darkness, the same unnatural gleam in its eyes. It was him, the same figure from the lobby, the same man who had claimed that Nathaniel was his vessel. But something was different now. The figure's body seemed to flicker like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. It wasn't fully real. It was as if it was an echo of the curse, not just a manifestation of Nathaniel's fears, but something far older, far deeper, lingering just beneath the surface. "You thought you were free," the figure said, its voice like a whisper carried by the wind, yet full of chilling finality. "You're not. You can never escape what's in your blood, Nathaniel. You belong to the darkness, and the darkness always claims what's its own." Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest. The world around him seemed to warp, the shadows bending and twisting. He didn't know how, but he could feel the curse awakening again. It was like an old friend, an old enemy, stirring beneath his skin. "You don't control it," the figure continued, its eyes glowing with malevolent satisfaction. "You never have. It controls you. And now, it's time for you to come back to it." But Nathaniel wasn't the same man he had been in that lobby. The darkness no longer terrified him. He had faced it, confronted it, and won. He wasn't just a vessel. He wasn't just a puppet to be pulled by strings. He was in control of his own fate. He took a slow, steadying breath, his gaze hardening. "I don't belong to you," Nathaniel said, his voice clear and unshaken. "And I don't belong to the darkness. I am the darkness, but I choose how it lives in me." The figure's form trembled for a moment, the edges of its body flickering. But then it laughed low and menacing, as if mocking Nathaniel's defiance. "You can't fight what you are," the figure hissed, its voice full of scorn. "You can't change what's inside you." But Nathaniel was already moving, stepping forward with purpose. He could feel the power surging within him, his own inner strength thrumming beneath the surface. The figure was wrong. The curse might have lived inside him, but he was the one who had control over it. With a surge of energy, he reached inside himself, calling upon the power he had learned to command. The shadows around him twisted, coiled like serpents, but instead of crushing him, they formed around him like armor. The figure screeched, its form warping, losing shape as it was drawn back by the pull of Nathaniel's will. "This is my darkness," Nathaniel declared, his voice strong, filled with the weight of everything he had learned. and it's not yours to control anymore. With a final, deafening scream, the figure was torn apart by the force of Nathaniel's power, its form disintegrating into the air, leaving only the faintest echo of its presence behind. Nathaniel stood there, breathing heavily, his heart still racing, but no longer in fear. The power he had once feared, the darkness that had once ruled him, had been transformed into his strength. He was free, truly free. For now, he knew the curse was not something to be fought. It was something to be understood. And from this point forward, he would live his life as the master of his own fate, knowing that the darkness within him would never again define who he was. It would simply be a part of him. And that was enough. Nathaniel stood in the alley, the lingering remnants of his battle with the figure dissipating into the night air. The echo of his own breath was the only sound left. He felt an eerie sense of calm, as if everything had finally clicked into place. The darkness he had feared for so long no longer felt like a foreign, threatening force. It was now part of him, and he knew how to wield it. For the first time, he could truly breathe without fear. Yet, something gnawed at him. The figure had said he could never escape what was inside him, but the thing was, he didn't want to escape it anymore. The more Nathaniel reflected on his words, the more he realized something important. The darkness was a reflection of his past, of every mistake and misstep, every trauma and fear he had bottled up inside. It was part of him, but it didn't define him. What mattered now was how he moved forward, how he lived with it. Nathaniel turned and walked back toward the city streets, still haunted by that strange feeling, the feeling that something was coming. The presence he had felt earlier, the one lurking just outside his awareness, hadn't gone away. It still hung there like a shadow, an unseen force at the edge of his vision. He couldn't ignore it. Not now, not after everything he had learned. Something was wrong. His steps quickened as he walked through the city. He hadn't fully processed everything. He hadn't even fully wrapped his mind around what had happened to him. But now, as he walked, there was a deep, unsettling sense that the danger wasn't over. The world had been different before the curse, and it seemed that despite his victory, it had somehow changed. The city around him felt off. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something. Nathaniel's heightened senses, those that had once been drowned by fear, now caught every detail. The flicker of a streetlight, the shadow that seemed to move against the grain of the light, the strange absence of sound around him. He turned down a side street, his eyes scanning for any sign of trouble, his hand instinctively hovering near his jacket pocket where a small, silver locket hung from a chain. It was his mother's, his last tie to a life before the curse, before everything had changed. The locket felt like a connection to something normal, something untouched by darkness. And yet, even it felt different now. It had grown colder against his chest. Then he saw it. At the far end of the street, a shadow shifted, then moved purposefully, as if it were following him. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. The figure had been destroyed. It couldn't be real. But there it was, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, another figure, tall, looming, indistinct in the darkness. It moved with an unsettling grace, like something out of nightmare, its shape barely visible. But Nathaniel could feel it. His heart beat harder, faster, and he knew. This wasn't over. Something was still out there, waiting. Before he could react, the figure was gone. No. Nathaniel stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind racing. He wasn't sure if what he had just seen was real or another manifestation of his fear, but it didn't matter. He had learned too much about the curse to let his guard down now. He moved quickly down the street, toward the alleyway where he had seen the figure, his senses alert. His thoughts were a whirlwind. Did the curse never truly leave him? Was he being tested again? Or was something else rising to fill the void the figure had left behind? The darkness that he had once fought so desperately to rid himself of was back, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't as simple as running from it. Nathaniel had learned that much. It wasn't something external, something that could be chased away. It was a part of him. And now, that part of him needed answers. He reached the alley where he had first encountered the figure, only to find it empty, silent. No one was there, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. He could almost hear it now, the faint sound of something moving in the shadows, just out of his reach. His breath quickened as he turned to look down the alley's winding path. There was something, a shape, barely visible at the far end. He squinted, trying to make it out. It was like the figure was, waiting for him. Nathaniel stepped forward, his heart pounding. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to retreat into the safety of the world he had left behind. But he refused. The time for running was over. He had taken control of his fears. Now it was time to confront whatever this was. "Show yourself," he said, his voice firm, though the edge of doubt lingered. There was no answer, but the shadow at the end of the alley seemed to pulse, growing larger, denser, like it was alive. Nathaniel's grip tightened around the locket as he took another step. Then, a voice echoed through the alley, soft and eerie, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You can't escape." The words chilled him to the core, but this time, there was no fear. He knew what the figure was trying to do. It was trying to make him doubt himself again, to make him believe the darkness had power over him. But Nathaniel had already defeated that lie. "I already escaped," he called back, his voice steady. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." The shadow flickered again, but this time it didn't retreat. Instead, it grew even darker, its form expanding and twisting in ways that defied reason. Nathaniel took a deep breath, preparing himself. Whatever this thing was, whatever force was lurking in the shadows, it wasn't going to control him again. He raised his hand and called upon the power within him. He didn't need to fight it. He didn't need to banish it. He simply needed to understand it, to integrate it, to make peace with it. The shadows around him surged, swirling as if responding to his will. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an energy that crackled in the night. "You think you understand it now," the voice murmured, the figure's form twisting in response to Nathaniel's command. "You still don't know the truth." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "Then tell me." The figure seemed to hesitate, as though considering whether or not to reveal what it truly was. But instead of answering, it simply dissolved into the shadows, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the alley, his senses tingling with a strange mixture of triumph and unease. The truth was still out there, and Nathaniel knew one thing for certain. This battle was far from over. Nathaniel stood alone in the alley, the shadows dissipating into the cold night air. The lingering sense of unease still clung to him, despite the overwhelming silence. He was no longer alone in his understanding of the curse, no longer a victim to the darkness. But the figure's final words echoed in his mind, and with them came an unsettling realization. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing. Something much bigger loomed on the horizon, and Nathaniel had only begun to scratch the surface. He turned and started walking, his footsteps steady, but his thoughts were a whirlwind. That voice, it had been so sure of itself. It had spoken with the kind of conviction that came from knowledge, from understanding something deeper than what Nathaniel had ever dared to comprehend. And when it had mentioned the truth, something about it had felt like a warning. A warning that Nathaniel had no choice but to heed. His feet took him toward his apartment, the familiar streets of the city now seeming strange to him. Each turn felt more deliberate, more purposeful, as though his path was already set, like he was being drawn somewhere, guided by something invisible. As he reached the entrance to his building, Nathaniel paused. Something tugged at his consciousness, something subtle, like a whisper that didn't quite make it to his ears but vibrated in his bones. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it, but the sensation remained, gnawing at the edges of his awareness. His apartment felt strangely empty when he entered. The air felt heavier, thick with an energy that wasn't there before, as if the very walls were watching him, waiting. The calm he had once found in these four walls seemed distant now, Nathaniel walked toward the small desk in the corner, his fingers brushing against the surface as he absent-mindedly scanned the room. It felt like there was something waiting for him, something he needed to find, something that would give him the answers he desperately sought. And then his gaze fell on the bookshelf. He hadn't really paid attention to it in the last few weeks, not since the curse had fully taken hold of his life. But now, something about it felt different, as if something had shifted. He stepped closer and began to scan the titles. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then his fingers stopped on a thick, leather-bound book that he didn't remember ever seeing before. It was old, its cover cracked with age, and there was no title on the spine. Nathaniel pulled it from the shelf, the book surprisingly heavy in his hands. As he opened it, the first few pages were filled with strange symbols, written in a language he didn't recognize. The pages smelled of ancient parchment and dust, the kind of smell you'd associate with forgotten knowledge. But then, as his eyes moved across the pages, they landed on something familiar, a symbol that nearly made his heart stop. The dark, twisted shape was unmistakable, the sigil that had haunted him since the very beginning. The sigil he had seen over and over again in his nightmares, in the figure's eyes, and in the places he feared the most. The symbol that had been etched into his skin when the curse took hold. This was the key. The book was the missing piece, the map to the understanding he so desperately needed. Nathaniel flipped through the pages, his heart racing with every turn. There were drawings of figures, faces, and symbols. Some of the sketches were blurry, indistinct shadows of long-forgotten things. But as he moved deeper into the book, it became clear. The sigil was connected to something far older than he had imagined. Something that had existed before him, before the curse, before the city itself. He read aloud a passage that seemed to resonate with a deep, unsettling truth. To summon the darkness is to awaken the past. It is to walk the line between worlds, between what is known and what should never be known. And when the curse is invoked, it does not come from within. It comes from the forgotten. Nathaniel's blood ran cold as he absorbed the words. The curse was older than he had ever realized. It wasn't just his curse. It was part of something much, much older, something that had been dormant for centuries, waiting to rise again. And somehow, he had awoken it. The book seemed to hum in his hands, as if alive with the power it contained. Nathaniel could feel it vibrating, a strange energy filling the room. He slammed the book shut, but the feeling lingered. That feeling of being watched, of being pulled. He placed the book on the desk, his mind racing. What did it mean to walk the line between worlds? And what was this forgotten thing that had been waiting for him to awaken it? Suddenly, a thought struck him, the presence. It was still there, that same feeling of being watched, but it wasn't just the figure from the alley. No, this was something more. Something old. Nathaniel's hand hovered over the locket again. It was as if the very act of touching it sent ripples through the air around him. He opened it, revealing the faded photo of his mother inside. The woman who had disappeared from his life when he was a child, vanishing without a trace, leaving only a lingering, painful absence. The thought hit him like a lightning bolt. What if she had known about the curse? What if she had been part of it? Nathaniel's mind flashed back to the strange occurrences in his childhood, the inexplicable nightmares, the cold, unsettling feeling that seemed to follow him everywhere, the sense that something other was always just beyond his grasp. Could his mother have been connected to the curse? Could she have known the truth all along? A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts, and he jumped, startled. He hadn't heard anyone approach, and the feeling of being watched intensified. His pulse quickened. He moved cautiously toward the door, his heart racing. When he opened it, there was no one there. But there, on the doorstep, lay an envelope. It was old, yellowed with age, and sealed with a dark red wax. The symbol, the same symbol that had appeared in the book, the same one that had been branded into his skin. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. His hand trembled as he picked up the envelope, the weight of it almost too much to bear. There was no return address, no name, only the symbol. He tore open the envelope, his heart racing as he unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was written in the same language as the book, the symbols strange and alien. But one word was clear. One word stood out above all the others. Come. And beneath it, the faint outline of a map. Nathaniel's world tilted. He wasn't just fighting an ancient curse anymore. He was about to step into a world of forgotten truths, and the darkness that had always haunted him was only the beginning. Nathaniel's mind raced as he stared at the map, its lines and symbols etched across the page in an unsettling ancient script. The more he looked at it, the more he realized that it wasn't just a map, it was a trail, a guide leading him somewhere. Somewhere important. But where? And why now? He felt the familiar tug again, the one that had drawn him to the alley, the one that had pulled him through the nightmare he thought he had escaped. This wasn't just a series of random events. It was a puzzle, and the pieces were beginning to click into place. He glanced around his apartment one last time, as though searching for something he might have missed. The room still held that strange heaviness, the air thick with an energy that seemed to pulse with every breath he took. The shadows in the corners seemed darker now, as though they were watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. But Nathaniel didn't have the luxury of waiting. Gripping the map tightly in his hand, he stuffed it into his jacket pocket and headed out the door. The city was waiting for him, dark and sprawling, the streets winding in ways he never noticed before. It wasn't the same as it had been before the curse had fully taken hold. The air felt alive, as though the very atmosphere was charged with an unspoken promise. He wasn't sure if it was the map or the message that had set this in motion, but Nathaniel felt as if he were walking into the unknown. The figure from the alley, the strange presence he had felt for so long, they were just the beginning. As he walked, the quiet hum of the city faded into the background. It was as though everything had quieted in anticipation of what was to come. The streets, usually bustling with activity, seemed empty now. No cars passed, no people walked by. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for him to reach the place where the map led. He found himself on a narrow street, one he didn't recognize. The buildings towered around him, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the night was alive and moving. The map tugged at him again, a strange magnetic force guiding him forward. His instincts told him he was close. Nathaniel glanced down at the map, tracing the lines with his finger. The markings were strange, but he could feel them. He didn't know how, but they resonated with something deep inside him. The next step was clear. He turned the corner and found himself in front of an old, decaying building. It was unremarkable at first glance, a crumbling structure with windows that had long since been shattered, the bricks worn by time and neglect. But as he stepped closer, something inside him told him this was the place. The destination that had been marked on the map. The door creaked open with a groan as he pushed it, its rusted hinges protesting the movement. Darkness stretched beyond the threshold, thick and suffocating. Nathaniel hesitated for a moment, the familiar sense of dread creeping back. But this time he didn't pull back. He stepped inside. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and age. The walls seemed to close in around him as he moved further into the building, the floor creaking beneath his boots. His breath echoed in the silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone here, that something or someone was watching him. As he moved deeper into the building, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own. Shapes flickered in the corners of his vision, disappearing before he could make them out. The faint hum of an unknown energy pulsed around him, growing stronger with every step. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hallway creaked open on its own. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, he moved toward the door, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he didn't. There was something here, something waiting for him. and he knew that he had to face it no matter what. As he stepped into the room, the air shifted, becoming colder, thicker. The shadows seemed to press in from all sides, closing him in until he could barely see anything at all. The faintest light flickered in the center of the room, casting an eerie glow on the walls. It was a symbol, the same symbol from the map, the same symbol that had branded his skin. It was etched into the floor, glowing faintly, as though it had been waiting for him. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward, drawn to the symbol as if some invisible force was guiding him. His hand hovered above it, trembling. This was it, the point of no return, the place where everything would finally be revealed. Before he could touch the symbol, a voice echoed through the room. "Lo, familiar. You've come far, Nathaniel." The voice sent a chill through him, its tone both cold and comforting at the same time. It was as if it knew him, knew everything about him. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but the room was empty. "You've made it this far," the voice continued, "but you still don't understand, do you?" Nathaniel's pulse raced. He knew this voice. It was the same one he had heard in the alley, the same one that had whispered the curse into his ears. But now it seemed closer, more real. The darkness is not just a part of you, Nathaniel. It is you. The room seemed to shift around him, the walls warping and bending as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. He struggled to maintain his footing, but the world felt like it was slipping away. "Your mother knew this," the voice whispered. "She was part of it. And so are you." Nathaniel felt a surge of panic. The voice was right. He didn't understand. He didn't know how deep this went. His mother, the curse, everything that had happened, it was all connected. But how? What did it mean? And why now? The light from the symbol flickered and began to pulse faster, like a heartbeat. As it did, a figure slowly began to emerge from the shadows. Nathaniel couldn't make out the details at first, but as the figure stepped into the light, he recognized it. It was his mother. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, locked onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. She looked exactly as he remembered, but there was something wrong about her. "I didn't want you to know," she said, her voice a distorted echo of its former warmth. "But now you have no choice." Nathaniel's legs felt like lead, his mind racing. The answers were right in front of him, but the fear, the uncertainty, the crushing weight of the unknown kept him rooted to the spot. "You have to stop it," his mother whispered, her voice cracking. "You have to stop it before it's too late." The ground beneath him shook, and the symbol on the floor began to glow with an intense, blinding light. Nathaniel closed his eyes, and then everything went dark. Nathaniel's heart thundered in his chest as the darkness swallowed him whole. His senses were overwhelmed, his body frozen in place, as if the very air itself was trying to suffocate him. The last thing he saw before the light consumed him was his mother's haunting face, those empty, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce through him, offering no comfort, no answers. Just more questions. The coldness seeped into his bones, but then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The weight lifted. The darkness faded. He opened his eyes, blinking against the sudden light. It was bright, far brighter than he'd expected after the suffocating shadows. But the light wasn't harsh. It was soft, almost ethereal, filling the space with a quiet, otherworldly glow. Nathaniel found himself in a room that seemed to stretch infinitely. The walls were obscured, as if they had no end, dissolving into the foggy, hazy atmosphere around him. His feet weren't touching the ground. Instead, he floated, weightless, suspended in space, unable to move or even feel the pull of gravity. He didn't know where he was or how he had gotten here, but this place felt wrong. It didn't feel like the world he knew. It felt like a place between places, a threshold. Then the voice came again, his mother's voice. But this time it was different. It wasn't the distorted version he had heard in the room, but something clearer, softer, more Paint. Nathaniel. The sound of her name made his stomach churn. He had spent his entire life wondering where she had gone, what had happened to her. The mystery of her disappearance had always haunted him, and now here, in the silence of this strange place, he could feel the weight of that question, heavier than ever. I never wanted you to become part of this. The words were fragmented, as if she was struggling to speak through a veil that separated them. Nathaniel tried to call out to her, but his voice caught in his throat as though the air had thickened around him, making even the simplest movements impossible. I never wanted you to see this, but it's too late. You've awakened it. Nathaniel's thoughts spiraled. What she meant by that? Too late? Had he been doomed the moment he'd found the map? The moment he'd set foot in that decaying building? I thought. She continued, her voice trembling with something he couldn't place. I thought if I could keep you safe, if I could hide the truth from you, maybe you would never know. Maybe you would never be part of it. Her voice broke, and the space around him seemed to tighten, as if the walls were closing in on him. The oppressive feeling from earlier, the feeling of being watched, returned. He could feel it now, something lurking just out of sight, something waiting for him to fall into its grasp. But it's not just your fate. It's everyone's. His mother's words were a distant, echoing cry. The curse is bigger than you. Bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. The air felt thick, like the entire room was closing in around him. He could barely breathe, could hardly think. His mother's words had shattered everything he thought he knew, but they weren't enough. He needed more. He needed to understand the why. Why was the curse connected to him, to her, to this place? I never wanted you to know, she whispered one last time, the words filled with a sense of finality. But now you have to decide. The light around him dimmed as her voice faded, leaving only the thick silence behind. The weight in the air lifted, but Nathaniel didn't feel any lighter. He felt lost. The space around him seemed to warp again, shifting and changing as though the very nature of reality was bending to its will. Suddenly, a flash of light exploded before his eyes, bright, blinding, sharp. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, everything went black. Nathaniel gasped as he was jolted back into consciousness, his body slamming against the cold floor. He could feel the rough texture beneath him, the solid, grounding sensation of the real world. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving with the force of the nightmare he had just experienced. He was back in the room, the same building, standing in front of the symbol that had drawn him here. His heart pounded in his ears, his pulse racing as his mind tried to process everything that had just happened. Had it been real? He couldn't tell, but the feeling, the intense weight of the curse was still there. It hadn't let go. The force, the presence, the unknown darkness, it was still with him, pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. He glanced around, his eyes darting to the room's corners, the shadows that lurked just out of sight. It was silent now, eerily silent, but he could feel the shift. The air was thick, charged with energy. Something had changed. Something had awakened. The map, the symbol, his mother's voice, the cursed sigil. They were all connected, pulling him towards something dark and ancient. But now, more than ever, Nathaniel knew he had no choice but to follow the path that had been laid before him. He stood, shaky but determined, and walked toward the center of the room. As his foot hovered over the glowing sigil, ground beneath trembled, and the light intensified, flickering like a heartbeat. It was time. Nathaniel knelt before the sigil, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. And the moment his fingers brushed against the symbol, the world around him shattered. The moment Nathaniel's fingers made contact with the sigil, everything around him seemed to collapse. The walls of the room, the faint glow of the symbol, and even the ground beneath him all seemed to dissolve into an endless void. There was no longer any sense of direction, no way to tell which way was up or down. His body felt weightless, as though he was being pulled through the very fabric of space itself. The world around him spun wildly, a whirlpool of shadows and blinding light. Time itself seemed to fracture, stretching out and then snapping back. His mind struggled to grasp at reality, but it slipped through his thoughts like sand. And then, with a violent jolt, everything stopped. Nathaniel found himself standing in the middle of an endless, empty landscape. The sky above was an unnatural shade of black, streaked with streaks of dull red. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and barren, stretching far into the distance. No trees, no buildings, no signs of life at all. It felt like a place forgotten by time, abandoned and left to rot. And yet, there was a strange sense of familiarity to it. A soft, whispering wind stirred the dust around his feet, carrying with it a faint scent of something ancient. This place, it felt wrong, as if it existed outside of the world Nathaniel had known, somewhere between dimensions. It was a place he could neither explain nor understand. His heart hammered his chest as he took in his surroundings. The air was thick with a presence, a heavy weight that clung to him, suffocating him from all sides. There was no sound here, except for his own breath, shallow and unsteady. And yet, Nathaniel could feel that he was not alone. Something else was here, something that was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. His skin prickled, and he spun around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. But there was no movement, no sign of anyone or anything near him. Then, from the far distance, a faint figure appeared, a silhouette against the red sky. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move toward him, its shape growing clearer with every step. It was a woman, but not just any woman. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. She looked exactly like his mother. Her face, pale and unmoving, stared at him with those same empty, haunting eyes. She moved toward him slowly, her steps deliberate, as though time itself was bending to her will. As she drew closer, the familiar pang of fear grew in Nathaniel's chest. But there was something different about her now. Her face was more gaunt, more hollow, as though time had ravaged her very soul. And her skin, it was cracked, as if the very flesh was deteriorating, revealing glimpses of something far darker beneath. "You shouldn't have come here, Nathaniel." Her voice echoed through the empty space, distorted and hollow. He wanted to speak, to ask her what was going on, but the words caught in his throat. Fear and confusion paralyzed him. His mother had warned him, hadn't she? She had told him to stop, to stay away from the curse. But he hadn't listened. And now, he was trapped in a world that wasn't his own. A place where rules no longer applied. "It's too late," she continued, her voice low and tinged with sorrow. "The curse. It's not just a force. It's a prison built by the forgotten." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. His mother's words made little sense to him. What did she mean by the forgotten? What prison was she talking about? "The darkness you feel," she went on, stepping closer to him, her movements slow and deliberate. "It isn't something that can be fought, Nathaniel. It's part of you. And now, it will consume you, just as it consumed me." The ground beneath his feet began to tremble. The sky darkened further, the red streaks turning into long tendrils of shadow that twisted like smoke in the air. The woman, his mother, extended her hand toward him. It was shaking, as if her body were fighting against the decay that had overtaken it. "You have to understand," she whispered, her voice carrying a deep sadness. "The curse was never just about power. It was about keeping us here, trapped. And now that you've awakened it, there's no way out. No way to undo what's been done." Nathaniel took a step back, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. This couldn't be real. His mother couldn't be dead, could she? And yet, here she was in front of him, but not truly her. Something was wrong. Something was twisting the very essence of who she was. And then he understood. This place, this dimension, wasn't just a space between spaces. It was a reflection of something far older, a place where the curse had its roots. And his mother wasn't the only one trapped here. They're all here, his mother's voice echoed, her face distorted by the shadows that began to swirl around her. The forgotten ones. They've been waiting for someone like you, for someone to finally break the barrier. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. The forgotten ones? The ground beneath him cracked open, a deep chasm forming at his feet. Dark tendrils of smoke and shadow reached out, writhing toward him like hungry fingers. "You've unleashed them," she said, her tone dark and final. "The curse is their way out, and now you're the key to freeing them." A sound broke through the growing tension, the sound of thousands of whispers. Low and guttural, they filled the air, overwhelming Nathaniel's senses. The shadows around him seemed to pulse and writhe, a deep hunger emanating from them. "No," he gasped, his mind racing. "I didn't." Before he could finish, the ground beneath him began to tremble violently, and the shadows exploded forward, sweeping him off his feet. The whispers grew louder, deafening in their intensity. And then he was falling. Not down, through. The world dissolved once again, but this time there was no void, no blackness. Instead, Nathaniel found himself hurtling through a world of darkness and light, of time and space bending around him. The shadows reached for him, their fingers like chains, pulling at his body, his soul. Everything was slipping away. His mother's face, the curse, the forgotten ones, all of it. And then there was nothing, just an endless, infinite fall, as if he were being cast into the very heart of darkness itself. Nathaniel's mind felt as though it were splintering into 1,000 pieces. The fall had no end, no bottom, no sense of time. He was adrift in an ocean of darkness, lost in a void where reality itself seemed to bend and twist around him. The whispers of the forgotten ones grew louder, surrounding him like 1,000 voices speaking in tongues, clawing at his thoughts, their hunger palpable. It felt as if they were trying to consume him, not just his body, but his very essence, his soul. Every heartbeat, every breath was a desperate plea for escape. But there was nowhere to run. Suddenly, with a force that nearly knocked the wind from his lungs, everything stopped. The fall ceased. The oppressive darkness faded, and Nathaniel was left suspended in midair, gasping for breath, disoriented, but somehow alive. He opened his eyes. This place, whatever it was different. He wasn't in the endless void anymore, but in a place of vast, crumbling architecture. The towering remnants of buildings, ancient and broken, stretch high above him. Their forms twisted in unnatural ways, like the bones of some long-dead titan. A sickly, greenish light bathed the landscape, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. There was no sky, no sun, just a faint glow that seemed to come from nowhere yet everywhere. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a mixture of rotting earth and ancient stone. A vast, empty plain stretched out before him, but it was dotted with strange, lifeless trees whose bark appeared to be made of metal, rusted and corroded. Their gnarled branches stretched upward like twisted hands, grasping at nothing, reaching for something that wasn't there. A low, constant hum filled the air, a deep vibration that seemed to resonate in his chest, almost as though the very ground beneath him was alive. Nathaniel slowly stood, his legs weak beneath him. The weight of the curse still clung to him, heavy in his chest, like a weight that could never be lifted. The memories of his mother's warnings flashed in his mind. The forgotten ones, the prison, the curse. He had awakened something ancient, something far beyond his understanding. Nathaniel. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was his mother's voice, but it wasn't coming from any one direction. It echoed around him, reverberating off the crumbling walls of the ancient city. His heart pounded as he spun around, trying to locate its source. "I didn't want this for you," The voice continued, her tone now heavy with sorrow and regret. But there is no turning back. You are the key to their freedom. You are the one who must make the final choice. The ground beneath him trembled again, and Nathaniel staggered, barely keeping his balance. The sound of hundreds of voices whispering, no, screaming, filled the air as if the very walls of this place were alive with their desperate cries. The Forgotten Ones, his mother's voice echoed. They are ancient. Their prison was built long ago by those who feared what they would become. But now the seal has been broken. Now they will be free. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him with full force. The Forgotten Ones were no mere creatures, no random spirits. They were ancient, imprisoned for a reason, and he had unknowingly shattered their prison, set them free. You must choose, his mother continued. They will come for you, Nathaniel, but you must decide, will you stand with them? Or will you try to seal them away again, at the cost of everything you know? The whispers grew louder, the voices of the Forgotten Ones now clear and distinct. They spoke of power, of freedom, of the centuries they had been locked away. Their hunger was palpable in their words, their promises of unimaginable strength and endless time. But their voices were wrong. The more they spoke, the more Nathaniel felt the sickness in their words, the deep corruption that festered within them. They didn't just want freedom, they wanted domination. They wanted to erase everything that stood in their way. Nathaniel staggered back, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a suffocating hand. The ground continued to tremble as something massive stirred beneath the earth. He could feel it, they were rising. The Forgotten Ones were coming. A crack appeared in the distance, a fissure in the ground, and from it a figure emerged. It was a woman draped in tattered robes that shimmered with an eerie, unnatural light. Her face was obscured by a dark hood, but Nathaniel could feel her gaze, cold and sharp, piercing through the darkness. The key has arrived, the woman said, her voice like silk wrapped around iron. We have waited for so long, and now we will take what is ours. The ground rumbled again as a second figure appeared, and then a third. They were emerging from the cracks, the shadows, as if this place, this forgotten world, was becoming their new domain. Their forms were twisted, their features grotesque, and yet there was a terrible beauty to them, something that made Nathaniel's skin crawl. The Forgotten Ones were alive, in a way he hadn't understood before. They were no mere shadows, no specters. They were real, and their presence felt like the suffocating weight of centuries. The curse had been their prison, and now that prison was broken. What will you do, Nathaniel? The voice of the first figure echoed again, but this time it wasn't his mother's voice. It was the voice of the ancient one who had been speaking from the very beginning. Will you seal us away again, or will you join us? The choice lay before him, clear and terrifying. Nathaniel knew that to seal them away again, to lock them back in their prison, would require a sacrifice, a great one. He would have to sacrifice himself, his very soul, to bind them forever. But if he chose to join them, to embrace the darkness they offered, he would become one with them, an immortal, powerful being in this broken world. The voices of the Forgotten Ones grew louder still, their calls of power, freedom, and eternity swirling around him, trying to drown out all other thoughts. For a moment, Nathaniel hesitated. The promise of power was tempting. The chance to rewrite the rules of the world, to finally have control over his own destiny. It was enough to make his heart race with fear and desire. But then, a memory came to him, a memory of his mother's face, twisted in agony as she spoke her last words. You have to stop it, before it's too late. Nathaniel's mind cleared, and for the first time since stepping into this nightmare, he understood. This was not about power. It was not about freedom. It was about survival. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let the darkness swallow everything. With every ounce of strength he had left, Nathaniel made his decision. He wasn't going to become one of them. He was going to end this. Nathaniel's mind spun as the Forgotten Ones closed in. The ground trembled beneath his feet, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. They had been waiting for centuries, and now they were so close to freedom, so close to reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. He could feel their hunger, the emptiness inside them, the terrible, insatiable craving for the world they had lost. But Nathaniel knew what he had to do. He couldn't join them. He couldn't let them spread their darkness across the world. The price would be high, but it was the only way. With a final glance toward the figures emerging from the cracks in the earth, Nathaniel stepped forward, his resolve hardening. They would not have him. "You cannot stop us." The first figure, the one who had spoken with such authority, said, her voice now a rasping hiss. "You are nothing but a child, a pawn in a game you don't understand." Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest. The words stung, but they didn't scare him. The world had already been consumed by the curse, and if he didn't act now, it would never be free. He reached into the pocket of his coat, fingers brushing against the cold, ancient key. The key that had brought him here. The key that had unlocked the doorway to this cursed place. This key was the only thing that could seal them away, that could trap them once more. But using it would come at a cost. Nathaniel had no doubt that the key would not just lock them away, it would lock him away with them. The price for his failure to stop the curse was his very existence. His fingers wrapped around the key. It was cool to the touch, its weight heavier than it had ever been. He took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the Forgotten Ones grow stronger around him, their eyes fixed on him with malicious intent. They were closing in. "You can't stop what's already been set in motion," the second figure hissed, her skeletal fingers reaching out toward him. "You will join us, whether you want to or not." Nathaniel didn't look back. He didn't care about their words. He cared only about saving the world he still loved. He plunged the key into the earth before him, driving it deep into the cracked ground. The moment the key made contact, the entire landscape shifted. The air around him grew thick, dense with the power of ancient forces awakening. The ground beneath him shook violently, and the Forgotten Ones let out a horrible, tortured wail. "No," the first figure screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "You cannot do this." But it was too late. The moment the key was turned, the curse began to unravel. A brilliant, blinding light erupted from the ground, flooding the entire realm. The Forgotten Ones recoiled, their forms disintegrating in the light, their shrieks dissolving into nothingness. Nathaniel closed his eyes, shielding himself from the blast of light. He could feel the force of the curse shattering, the ancient power tearing apart as the world he had entered began to collapse. The Forgotten Ones were being sealed away once more, their prison reforged, their freedom lost. But as the light intensified, Nathaniel felt himself being pulled into it. His body began to fade, his essence unraveling with the very fabric of this world. His chest tightened, his breath quickened, and the overwhelming realization struck him like a dagger in the heart. He was part of the curse. His sacrifice was the price for its end. He glanced up, seeing the fissures in the sky above him, the very air fracturing as the curse came to its final, violent conclusion. His vision blurred, his body fading like a ghost, and he was consumed by the light. And then there was silence. When Nathaniel awoke, it was as though he had been born again. The air was different, fresher, lighter. The oppressive weight of the curse was gone. The world around him was no longer a realm of decay and endless shadows. It was a place of life. The sky was blue, the sun shone brightly, and the landscape was dotted with lush green hills, rolling fields, and distant forests. For the first time since stepping into the cursed building, Nathaniel could breathe easily. He was lying on soft grass, the earth warm beneath his body. He pushed himself up, disoriented, but slowly, a sense of peace settled over him. He could hear birds singing in the distance. He could feel the wind on his skin. It was real. It was alive. Nathaniel stood, taking in his surroundings. It was a world he didn't recognize. But somehow, it felt like the world he had always known, only now it was whole, restored. The curse that had plagued it for so long was gone. As he stood there, a figure approached from the distance, a woman. She walked toward him with quiet grace, her steps soft but sure. Her face was serene, her eyes kind. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. It was his mother. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with tenderness. "You broke the curse. You freed us all." He wanted to speak, to ask her everything about the curse, about the forgotten ones, about what had happened, but words failed him. He simply stared, overwhelmed by the relief, the sense of peace that washed over him. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her smile gentle. "You've saved us. You've saved the world." Nathaniel's eyes welled with tears, but he didn't speak. The weight of everything that happened, everything he had lost and gained, was too much. The pain of the journey, the terror, the sacrifice, it was all gone now. His mother extended her hand, and he reached for it without hesitation. The moment their hands touched, he felt warmth, love, a connection that he hadn't felt in so long. "But what about you?" He whispered, his voice breaking. "Al, how are you here?" She smiled again, but it was different now. There was no sorrow in her eyes, only peace. "I'm at rest now, Nathaniel," she said gently. "The curse has ended. You did what I could never do. And now you can live a life free from the darkness." Nathaniel didn't know how long they stood there, in the warmth of the sun, in the beauty of a world reborn. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. The forgotten ones were sealed away, and the curse was no more. And though he had lost so much along the way, Nathaniel had won. He had freed the world, and in the end, that was enough.